But yeah, we can talk about whatever you want, man.
All right. So we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As you know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. So today I'm going to be having a robust conversation with a geneticist and a statistician, right? You're a geneticist and statistician on race and IQ, whether it's a social construct or whether it's biologically determined, and any other topic that comes up. So his name is Tadei Soa. Did I get
Sway,
it right?
sway,
Sway A. So there's a
yeah,
lot of there's a lot of vowels.
yeah,
There's a
it's
lot
all
of vowels in
vowels.
your name.
Yeah,
That's interesting. What's the origin of your name and what does it mean?
the ancient it means something like a tribe of a snake or something. So anciently, it comes from somewhere in like West or like it's somewhere in Mauritania or like Morocco where it came from, but it
Mm.
was translated to French. That's why there's so many vowels.
Oh,
So I actually have a
oh,
cousin, and
oh.
he translated his to English, and in English it's like SWAY instead of SOU.
Mm.
So it's the French translation. I mean, it has a lot of vowel sounds, no matter what. Like there's no way around that. But it's the translation, like it makes it a lot worse.
Mm. That's interesting. That's interesting. So, you're French Moroccan descent.
No, my father is. So
Your
Irish on
father
my
is.
mom's side. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh.
my dad is. So my dad came to America when he was like I don't know, 16. He got brought to America by the Peace Corps,
Mm.
and then he met my
That's an
mom. My
interesting
mom's American.
mix.
Yeah. So it's a
That's good. So you take from the continent of Africa, you take from the continent of Europe, and yeah, in America as well.
yeah, exactly.
It's good. It's good.
So
So,
so
can
where
you
are you?
just
Hold
tell
on.
us?
Are you in Nigeria?
Yes, I am. I'm in
Oh
Nigeria.
wow. Okay. Where?
Yeah. Currently, I'm in a city called Asaba, which is the capital
Okay.
city of Delta State, where I'm from. But I'm based in Lagos, so I came for work, so that's why I'm here currently.
So I was just in South Africa not that long ago,
Oh, oh.
and it
How
was
did you find
interesting
South
talking about
Africa?
race. They do not like Nigerians.
Yeah, they do. They
Yeah.
certainly do not. There's a lot of xenophobia targeting Nigerians in South Africa. Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
very interesting to see that because I don't know how aware you are of this in the U.S. But in the U.S., it's not like in South Africa at all. But there's a little bit of a backlash. There's like American descendants of slaves versus like immigrants from Africa, and it was interesting to see that in
Mm,
South Africa, where you have these people who are like, "We
yeah.
suffered. You guys didn't suffer. You look like us. Don't come in here and like take our prizes, right?" And
Mm,
it's interesting that that happens in Africa, right? People wouldn't think that would
yeah.
happen there, but it's not. I mean, South Africans, the like native South Africans, I guess they sort of have taken on the role that people have taken on here,
Yes.
right? As they deserve something. So if you're coming in from Nigeria, like, what are you doing? You're taking our jobs, our women, like, go away. Like they
Yeah.
do
The
not like
women
you.
part. I was going to bring that up.
That's I mean that's true. Yeah, they did not. It was pretty. So I was with a friend there. He's from Burkina Faso,
Mm.
and they just you could tell like yeah he wasn't popular. They're very skeptical of like anyone from like West Africa, I think. So
No, I think it's a sort of an in-group, out-group thing. People are always suspicious of groups outside of themselves, right? And
yeah,
and it doesn't matter. Humans just have this tendency of dividing themselves by whatever metric. So if it's not skin color, if it's the skin color, then it has to be ethnicity or some other thing. There's got to be something that
but I
humans
think the
sort of
South Africa
divide
one
themselves around.
and the African American one there's an interesting similarity that's not common, right? It's not that common at least where you have a population that feels like they were oppressed and they uniquely were oppressed and other people that look like them should like they're afraid that they're going to come in and take that thing that like that they deserve,
Mm,
right? And so I don't think that happens all over the world. Like that's probably something that's restricted to a few countries, right?
yeah.
You have to have some like large like either minority, I guess in South Africa it's a small majority, I guess, of people that feel that way.
Mm.
So
Yeah, yeah. So I think you usually find such things in places that have this history of, you know, like South Africa's history and that of the US. There's some similarities in which one quote unquote racial group dominates and oppresses another one. So the cultural attitudes and surrounding groups, social formations of groups will tend to be similar.
Mhm.
So with the South Africans feeling that, oh, they are an oppressed group, and other Nigerians coming in, you just like with the ADOS thing. I was on Twitter today. There was a guy that was saying he was listening out to a couple of things that apparently now he's a white supremacist, and he's also non-ADOS, so he cannot comment on black issues. Right?
Yeah.
It's just the same thing as with South Africa, and I was like, you know what? Yeah, you're black, but I think African Americans are like an ethnicity of their own. They have their own history, they have their own culture, they have so it's not really the same. It's
Oh, for sure.
you,
Yeah, yeah,
you
no.
might have the same skin color, but what literally not the same people. The history is different. And even if you want to go genetic wise, it's still different because there's an
Very different.
admixture
Yeah.
with Europeans and all that.
It's not
So
just the
yeah,
admixture, though. I mean, like 10 generations is a long time.
yep.
I mean, so 10 generations, I mean, if you want to know about genes, like 10 generations, if you talk about an ancestor from like 10 generations ago, you only have like some DNA from around 25% of them. So the majority of them are
Wow.
gone. They're not in you,
Yeah.
right? And then of those like 25% is there's about 5% of the because so 10 generations, if you're good at math, is 2 to the 10th power. So that's you so you have 1024 great 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 like
Mm.
and then some of them are the same person, right? Because people are a little bit like at 10 generations they're pretty like if everyone had a unique ancestry, then there would have to have been a lot of people in the past, and there's not. So we're
Mm.
somewhat inbred, but still give or take 1,000 people in your past 10 generations ago, and of those is around maybe 50 who actually contributed DNA to you.
Mm.
So if there's a person whose ancestors all were in Africa, say in 1650, and they compare themselves to somebody who is in Africa and also had, was in like their ancestors were in the same place in 1650, there's a chance that they have no identity by descent because they have 5%. They have 5%. It has to be that same 5%. So like
Mm.
the chances are low, right? So that's interesting.
Wow.
That I mean, 10 generations. I mean, you make a new ethnicity. What makes you not make a new ethnicity is purely just like identity. Like there's a group of people that I think they're the longest that I've seen anybody sort of hold on to something. They're called the Greco people, and their DNA is like really fascinating. They're in southern Italy, and they've been there. I don't want to say because I don't have it in front of me, but something ridiculous, like 2,000 years or 3,000 years ago. Like no, I'm sorry, like more than that. So that's 2,000 years BC. Yeah, so like 5,000 years. So they came from Greece to
Wow.
Italy 5,000 years ago, and they still speak Greek. So that's why they're still Greek. They have a Greek identity. Now the Greek that they speak is like ancient Greek, so they can't really talk like they don't speak the same Greek that people speak today. But they still speak something that's a type
Mm.
of Greek. Their genetics don't look anything like people from Greece. It's just been too long, but they're still
Mm.
Greek just because they speak Greek, and also
Mm.
in southern Italy you can walk around and see like there's like Greek monuments, so they think it's kind of theirs, right? So they haven't assimilated, and it just shows. I mean, you can last 5,000 years without doing it, but you're not who you were, right? You can avoid becoming the new group. Like Black Americans can say, okay, we're never gonna assimilate and become white Americans, but you're gonna lose where you came from. You're no longer the same as the people in the
Mm.
old country. You don't have to, I guess, join up with the majority group in the new country, and that's what these like people have done. They've just stayed Greek because they're just really proud, or for whatever reason. I don't know that much about them, but they still have like the dances, like the language, the food, all the things that they sort of care about, and they're not gonna sort of. I mean, some probably have like assimilated, which is why the population gets like smaller and smaller. But there's still people like holding on, and you can do that. Even if you're not who you were, yeah, you can just avoid ever becoming the group. That's fine.
Wow. So now this ties me to my first question to you, which would be, what is ethnicity? How would you? What are the elements that makes up ethnicity, an ethnic group?
I don't know what ethnicity means. I don't know what people mean by that. Like, I think a lot of this stuff is fraught. Where sometimes it's people are just trying to say race, and they just don't want to use that word because it's just some people think it's impolite. And then Other times they're talking about like culture or like a language, right? So usually I think, I mean, before we had like widespread like sequencing studies, it was a like language thing, right? So we basically it tracks decently. It's not perfect. There's some weird exceptions, which is cool and like really interesting. But for the most part, like language sort of determines group. So you speak a language. I mean, not English because that's the that's too big. But basically, you speak a language. That's like a language family, right? And so you kind of like go out like that, and you can go
Mm.
in and speak. Like the small language that you speak would be like your group, and like your like sort of race, or your bigger group would be like the like family like of languages. So I think in West Africa, it's a Niger Congo languages are big, and then what Bantu languages are like all over like Central Africa, right? So like those would be sort of people will use these words as ethnicities. A lot of African Americans they use the word Bantu to describe themselves, which is wrong, but that sort of comes sort of I mean it's a mistake, but it comes from I think an ethnic description based on a language. So I mean in genetics we use the word an ancestry. So we talk about ancestry groups to sort of explain that it's not because ethnicity doesn't really have a scientific definition. So when someone says I don't know if they're talking about religion and culture or what, but ancestry groups is what they try to say in genetics. I think that's sort of a mistake a little bit in genetics, but it's that's sort of as scientific as if you want a scientific term that tries to like separate people, it would be that. It'd be ancestry groups.
So, how would you define ancestry groups? What are the features of an ancestral group? So I was reading Human Diversity by Charles Murray, and he made this a similar point that you're making now, that using the word ethnicity or even race itself might be imprecise in the sense that those things can be very fluid. But he adopted the term ancestral groups. So when you say ancestral groups, what exactly are you looking at? Is it language? Is the language superimposed on a common genetic origin or a common
No, so I mean, a lot of it is just the language thing is sort of so basically scientists are sort of looking at when this very first started. You have to understand like one thing that scientists do is they'll look at data, they'll play with the data, and then when it matches what they believe to be true, then they think it's true, which isn't very
mm,
scientific, right? But it's just because imagine you do a genetic like you find a way to use genes to separate people and they fit into two groups and you just have no idea why they're in these two groups. It's just inexplicable. And then you do it again and now people like from Africa are in one group and all the other people are in a different group. You say, well, that must be it. That must be the correct way to do it. And it's not completely arbitrary. Obviously, it's not that, but there is some of that. There's definitely some of that in science where an ancestry group is how we can separate ourselves genetically that matches the groups that we believe already exist, right? And so I mean, I wrote a chapter in Sheena's book. I think it comes out in December, and I showed like the algorithm that Charles Murray, well, he doesn't use it, but that he quotes, right? So like the algorithm that like proves race if you pare down the amount of like black people to like instead of being 13%, you make them like I think 4%, and then you just get people like randomly sort of in the world, but you get like say 60% or like maybe half like European. Or no, I'm sorry, it's 40% European, maybe 60 like 50 to 60%, like so so basically yeah, so 40% European, 30% South Asian, so like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and then 30% East Asian, and then say 30% like European. That would be 10%. But so then you put like 5% people that identify as African American. You do that same algorithm, and now the African American group are with the South Asians. So they're just superimposed with the people from South Asia. So you don't get a racial cluster. So like these algorithms are sensitive to sort of not just the parameters, but the amount of people in each group,
mm.
right? So if you put, I mean, it's somewhat like trivial if the numbers could get small enough, right? But if you put one person from Africa in a sea of all people like from Europe, the algorithm's not going to find that he's like any different. But if you put half and half, now sort of it's going to find sort of that axis because that axis is going to describe a lot of like the like variation in that data. So, but yes, but I would say the main way that we do it, is we take ancestry components. So I don't know how familiar. Does that make any? Does that ring a bell?
Well, ancestry components. Maybe you can break it down a bit.
I'll try to do it. So, okay, how much? Just depends how much you like math. But so you can imagine that genetics is sort of a high dimensional space. So imagine that like you're comparing me and you, and you look at one SNP. Now, the SNPs don't have that many options, right? So for every SNP, you have one of three numbers. You have 0, 1, or 2. And what that means is we've basically chosen one SNP to be worth like 0, and the other SNP is the alternative SNP. And why that is doesn't matter. It could just be like totally random. If you have two copies of the alternative one, then you're a 2. If you have one copy, you're a 1. If you have 0, you're a 0. So we change the genome into the amount of copies of the alternative allele. And what people will say, well, like, how will that work? What if like you have a C from your mom and a G from your dad, and I have like a T from my mom and an A from my dad? Like, how can you? That almost never happens among
Hmm.
humans. Like humans are pretty similar. The chance of us being the same is obviously like very high. And if we're not the same, there's sort of one alternative option, and then you might have one or two copies, and that's pretty much across the world. Now there's exceptions, but you can basically put everybody into that space without, and you lose hardly anything because there's so few cases where there's three alleles at one spot, right? So anyway, so now you have, okay, the first allele, that's like axis 1, the second allele, that's axis 2, the third allele, and so if you have thousands of alleles, you have thousands of like different axes. And so one thing that they were surprised, I guess, is that there's not any SNP that separates groups. There's no single SNP. There's no single
Hmm.
variant that's only in one group. No, I should take that back. There are single variants that are only in one group, but for example, there's probably a variant that's only in you, so therefore it's only in your group, but
Hmm.
it doesn't do a good job because it's in one person in your group, right? So
Hmm.
there's single variants that are in very, very small groups of people, or one person, but there aren't single variants that'll do a good job separating groups of people. So you have to use more than one. So what you start to do is you start to add up combinations of variants and weights. So the simplest example that I give for this is, imagine you can only see in one dimension. So imagine that somehow you can only see how tall somebody is, or how big they are, like their mass. And I don't know how much you know about sports, but let's imagine that you're looking at American athletes, and you're looking at professionals in basketball and in football, American football. And so what you'll realize is there are some very tall American football players, and there's some pretty short American basketball players. Like on average, basketball players are taller, but there's definitely a lot of basketball players that are shorter than a lot of football players. So if you can only see how tall someone is, you can't do a very good job telling who plays basketball, who plays football.
Hmm.
And if you can only see how big someone is, you still can't do a very good job, because some of these guys that play basketball, not just like Shaq, who's actually very big, even the guys who aren't that big, they're so tall that they still weigh like quite a lot. Right?
Hmm.
So a football player who might be 6 foot and like really buff still won't weigh more than someone who's like, say, 6'10" and not that big, because height, right, it makes you like pretty heavy, right? So you can't tell them apart by height, you can't tell them apart by weight. But what can you think of one? There's one number that you can tell them apart by. Can you think of what it is?
No.
Okay, well, you can take their weight divided by their height,
Hmm.
their
So you
density.
can get you can get their density, and in medical terms, if you want to take the height square all over the
Well,
weight
yeah, I mean, how to
square all
actually
over
do
height,
it
you
in
can get the
PCA,
BMI and
it's a
all that.
little in. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm making it simple. In genetics, you
Yeah.
have to add components. You can't divide, but you can convert to log space and then subtract, which is the same as when you divide. So, I mean, there's some
Hmm.
like technical things, but you can just kind of imagine, okay, like you're a person that can only see along one dimension, but that's okay because I make a new dimension that's height divided
Hmm.
by weight. And now I plot them all on that dimension. And on that dimension, all the guys that are very dense play football, and the guys that play basketball
Hmm.
are not dense. So now the groups will separate. So I
So
just found a
now,
way to now you don't need to do that because you can see in two dimensions. So you can just see a plot and you can see, oh,
yeah.
here's the two different groups. And if you could only see in one dimension, this is a way that we can sort of take the information in 2 dimensions, most of it's not perfect, but we can get 80% of sort of what we would see in two into 1 dimension. If you use the original X and Y, say height and weight, you can't see that, right? And so that's what sort of PCA and all these things are like trying to do. They're saying, okay, like, is there a way that I can sort of add or divide or sort of, make a combination? And so you can kind of say, okay, like, there's no single variant, but if you look at the amount of people that have, say, they're a 1 for this one, also a 1 for this one, and they're a 1 for one of these three, and they're not a 2 for any of these, like, and that's a now group. Now that group of people will mostly be like from a place in Africa. So that's sort of ancestry components. Now the problem with doing that is very like underrated, is that what that'll do is it'll sort of give you, say, PCA1. And I don't know if you've read this, but I'm sure that Charles Murray probably talks about it. Like PCA1 is like the like African component, or the non-African component, depending on how you want to look at it. And then PCA2 is the East Asian component, right? And so the idea is PCA1 will sort of tell you if you have any ancestry in Africa. And so, I mean, I've sequenced my like genome. I'm like over here, like Europeans are here, people from Africa, but people from Africa are pretty spread out on this, but they're somewhere on here, right? So you can see like where you go on PCA1, and that'll describe 10% of like the variance. And what that probably is that the largest founder groups who left Africa had a certain sort of a pattern. So basically, everybody who wasn't say like 50,000 years ago, almost all the people are in Africa, and then there's one group of people from Africa that leaves, and so those people are all sort of pretty related, and so they all have sort of something in common, and that's what the algorithm will like tell you when you say, okay, I'm going to give you half Africans, half Europeans. What's different? It's going to say this. And if you get it, say, a quarter Africans, a quarter like Europeans, a quarter South Asians, a quarter East, it'll still say this. But it'll just say, yeah, the East Asians, they also have this component. All the Africans don't, or all the Africans do, and all the rest don't. Like that part, like, does not matter. But the problem with that is, okay, like this is this sort of founder pattern. There's two problems. That some people in Africa do have that, right? Because those ancestors who left, some of them stayed. Right. So it's not going to, it works better for telling you that you're in the group that left, but you could have still been in the group that left and stayed. Right. That's one problem. And then the other problem is because basically you sort of have a group of people that are very related, the non-Africans, it doesn't tell you, when you look at that component, it doesn't tell you anything about how related the African people are. And so if you look at a PCA plot and you look at the space, right, like say two people are this far apart, the African people, those spaces won't reflect their genetic distance very well, right? So when you're trying to separate people by groups, you end up with a group that actually they don't resemble each other that much, and then another group where they just lack one pattern, but they don't all have the same pattern. It's kind of like thinking like to try to make it like really simple is like, I don't know, you can think of it in terms of, I don't know, like a car or something, right? So it's like all the people that left Africa, they all got in like a Ford. And so when you cluster ancestry groups, it says, look, there's all these people who they drive a Ford. They're different. And they're like half the world, they're actually like the majority of the world, right? So there's 5 like billion people all driving a Ford. And then these people are the non-Ford drivers. But all the people who don't drive a Ford, they all drive a different car. They don't all drive, I don't know, a Chevrolet, right? They all have different cars. So the non-Ford thing tells you about a bunch of variants, but it's not, and it's true that the people have that sort of Ford in common, but the people who don't have that, they don't necessarily have something like in common in contrast from that. And that's, I mean, so I think that, I think race is, I think it's been destroyed, like any utility it would have, because it's, this is a like political tool at this point. But if we're going to talk about races, this is not maybe politically correct, but the closest thing you would have to a group that separates and has there's something like meaningful there, right? I would say would be like people from the New World.
So
So I
the
think
Native
that,
Americans.
yeah, so I would add, like, I would say the fact that the algorithm doesn't tell you that is kind of bad, because from a functional genetics point, that's actually what you would expect, right? So it's not honing in on functional genetics, which is what we care about. That's why we're doing, well, not everybody cares about that, but that's what most geneticists should care about, because we care about disease and like curing all these other problems and like how your brain functions, even like IQ. That's functional genetics. But what we're getting is an ancestry marker that says like, you guys are all came like, you guys all have a small little bit of your like DNA, because you all sort of share a founder population like 33,000 years ago. All people that like left Africa, but it's not a functional distinction. But if you want to talk about a functional distinction, I would say, yeah, New World people have, and they also came from a much smaller founder, like, like population, like really small, more recent, and their genomes, I would say, because they actually don't share any DNA from like 18,000 years. But that's interesting, right? If it had been longer, if we didn't, if Columbus or whatever, I mean, who knows who got there? But if somebody didn't sail across the ocean and we waited like 100,000 years, we would have like maybe like start to change, like two species, like a speciation. That maybe not 100,000. It could be 500,000. It's hard to say, but that's where you actually have a real separation of people, right? It was short. It wasn't long enough to say make them different. But if you were going to talk about functional genetics, that would make more sense, because we know. So, for example, I mean, the classic racial snip everybody brings up is sickle cell anemia. Are you familiar
Yep.
with that?
I was going to bring that up.
Oh,
But go
okay, yeah.
ahead.
So what do you know about that?
Okay, so I know that sickle cell anemia is caused by a mutation in one of the amino acids responsible for forming the hemoglobin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think polar valine is substituted for non-polar glycine. I think it's glycine and valine. Some, yeah,
I
one
know
of
the
them is
SNP. I think the
substituted for
SNP
the
is AT, but yeah, I think it's VG. I think you're probably right. Yeah,
yeah.
I think there's a glycine in there.
Yeah, so with that, it means that the hemoglobin that is formed um, becomes the cell wall of the hemoglobin is can deform pretty faster than with the normal hemoglobin. So it destroys faster. So with those who have the sickle cell traits, for example, there are those who are carriers, and then there are those who have the full-blown sickle cell traits. For those who are carriers, it confers a genetic advantage in places like Africa where there is high prevalence of malaria and all that. So that's why somewhat it's there is the gene survives, it proliferates somehow. But for those who get two copies of the defective gene, it becomes like a death sentence because their red blood cells are usually malformed and destroys on time, and it causes a lot of crisis, pain, and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, so that's, I guess, example that people like to bring up. That's like a like racial snip. And I think in a small local place like in like Brooklyn, if you have like a Polish population and like a Jamaican population, it sure seems true, right? None of the Poles seem to have this. Some of the Jamaicans do. I mean, Jamaicans are bad examples. They're a small island, so they have all kinds of things that are like very different than like everybody else. But anyway, you can imagine, you have a West African group and a Polish group, and obviously, like sickle cell seems to be sort of like separated by race, right? But if you look at it, the distribution of the ancestral map, and again, this is like changing because in Africa now people move, right? People move all over, so there'll be sickle cell everywhere, but there's going to be sickle cell everywhere in the U.S. But because we have a concept of race in the U.S., we won't forget where it comes from. Whereas in Africa, eventually, if people move around the continent, we're like, oh yeah, that's an African thing. But we won't realize that no, it wasn't. It's just that people move. But like because they move into the same race, we forget, right, when there's a separation. But if you look at
Mm.
sickle cell, I mean Nigeria is like number one in total births, obviously, because it's also a
Yeah.
huge population. Number two is India. It's also
Yeah.
kind of cheating because they have a huge population. But Bahrain is actually, I think, number one in percent. And so what you see in sickle cell is you see that it went around the world and it stayed places where there was like malaria. And it's even interesting, like some of it is sort of luck too. Like, so for example, there are people from Greece that have sickle cell that are carriers. It's rare, it's a lower prevalence, but there definitely are, and they're not like like mixed with a different group of people, not for like a very long time. So it's in Greece, but not Italy, right? So that's probably the main. That's not that tropical either one. So malaria is probably not super common there. Maybe, who knows, right? Maybe it just kind of happened by luck, right? But the selective pressure is obviously high if there is malaria. That's not all of Africa, right? So it's not, ancestally, it's not in South Africa at all, right? It's only in the like tropical part of Africa. It's in the uh, Middle East, and then it's in like India, Sri Lanka, the tropical part of South Asia. And that's an interesting one. But again, that's what I'm saying. That what does kind of matter is there's an exception. It's not in the New World, right?
Mm.
And probably
So
wouldn't have
I
been able
have
to make it. And we know
I have a
exactly how
question.
old that one is. So we know that like that's a cool one because we can actually sort of go back in time, and we know
Mm,
that that allele emerged around 6,000 years ago.
mm.
So 6,000
So
years ago, somebody got this mutation. We think he was in. I mean, we don't really know, but the assumption is probably somewhere in Africa, because we can sort of look at the diversity of the like haplotypes. There's more like diversity in Africa, so it probably was there first.
mhm.
And what's interesting is all those guys, right? So the Jamaican guy with sickle cell, or who's a carrier, right? The Nigerian, the Indian, the Sri Lankan, the Greek guy, they're all related. They all have that same ancestor, right? So they all have that same thing. And what determines whether you have that allele, it turns out not to be your race, but the weather, right? And luck, of course, right? But what determines if it's sort of in your ancestry, or if there's a good chance that it is it tropical? It's not tropical. It's really unlikely that you have, a parent or a grandparent that has it. But it turns out, so that's one where, and that to me is fascinating, because what we learn is we learn that human beings just before like agriculture, they moved around a lot. Like they just moved around, like, and that's what I think ancient genetics hasn't. The people haven't done a good job. Sort of like it's the weirdest thing. Like it's shocking. Like there was a cave in Morocco. They got their bones, and they aligned their DNA, and they share a pretty decent amount of their DNA with a Natufian population. Now Natufian is a group of people that were in the Middle East a long time ago, but they're not the ancestors of the current people there. And the Y chromosome found on Natufians is, I think, one of the most common chromosomes in Africa. So when people hear that, oh, Moroccans have a signature from the Middle East, people think, oh, of course, because the Arabs went there, the conquest is, it's not that, right? This is an ancient thing. And then the other like 40% of their DNA from these caves matches to a group of people called the Hadza. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Have you heard of them?
Hadza.
Yeah.
I think I've
No.
heard of that name. Yeah, I've heard of that name,
Yeah.
but
So
I
they're
can't
they're
really
famous
recall
because they're
anything
one of the
about it.
last hunter gatherers. I think they're in Kenya and Tanzania. They're
Yeah, I think
famous
I've heard of
because
that.
they eat baboons. They hunt baboons, and they're thought to be
Yeah,
like,
I watched it. I watched the documentary on that. Yes,
yeah.
I
So they're thought to
remember that.
be a genetic isolate, which means they have no ancestors related to anybody else for 50,000 years.
Mm,
But they have ancestors. They have people related to them more than anybody else in the world in Morocco around 10,000 years ago. So what happened, right? Like how did they get there? And what we learned from ancient Ended is that humans just moved, man. Like humans were insane at moving. Now, not they didn't go to the New World. I mean, some people think they did. People think they like I don't know sailed boats from Africa to like the New World. I don't think that evidence isn't very compelling. But it is, I think, almost shocking to see how much people moved pre, but from what we think is pre-technology, pre-farming, and it does almost seem like maybe farming obviously made people's lives a lot better in many ways, but it does that's sort of where people like settle down. Until people farm, they just seem to, and that's I have a friend. He's an archaeologist, so he looks at humans and Neanderthals, and his big thing is he thinks that is the only interesting thing about humans is their obsession with moving. Because he says like if you look at the caves, like we don't know that we're like smarter than them. Like we don't know much about them, right? We don't have much about them. But their caves, the human cave versus a like Neanderthal cave, the difference in the human cave is you'll find an artifact from like, really far away, from like 100 kilometers away. They'll have some dirt or some clay or some sand. So it's like humans have some weird thing where they just move around, which is, I think, an underrated understanding for people who are really into race. They just, unless we get a big barrier, and the Sahara wasn't that big of a barrier. Now, the oceans was, right? So we crossed the land bridge. That, I think, yeah, to be fair to people, that was a barrier. That was a barrier that people didn't cross. Unless there's a massive barrier, people don't stay in one place. And it seems like there's a good case that we stayed in one place less in the past than we do. Well, not than we do now, but obviously in the last 500 years, or last like 1,000 years, we moved a lot. But pre-boats, right? So like
Yeah,
before
I think
the most like sedentary that we've probably ever been is probably
mm,
like the time of Christ, right? That's when people really were in their tribe, in their group, in their place, right? And it turns out that our ancient ancestors moved around way more, which I think is just that's incredible. Like
but
that makes no
it
sense to
does
me.
make sense that people moved a lot then because human society was more likely going to be hunter gatherers, so they had to move to get food. So I think it was the development of our culture that settled people into communities where they stayed for a while, and even at that, breakaway groups would always they would form breakaway groups and they would just go out in search of other areas to populate. So it does make sense. But talking about selective pressure, I wanted to bring you back to a question. But let me quote Charles Murray. He said, "Human populations are genetically distinctive in ways that correspond to self-identified race and ethnicity." Now, my question that I want to superimpose on that thought would be, we talked about selective pressure. For example, how selective pressure caused the preponderance of the sickle cell gene in places that have malaria, right? What if we have groups, right, who
Mhm.
were isolated for whatever reason, right, in any geographical location, and certain external factors acted on them to create certain features that are unique to them, right? Might not be
Mhm.
100%, but those features are unique. Can't we, by that measure, say, oh, this is a group that is distinct, right? And we can tell me whatever we want to tell me. We can say maybe it's a race, or we can say maybe it's an ethnicity. The words we use are merely representations of things that we observe, right? So whether it's race or ethnicity. So can selective pressure cause the emergence of groups that are distinct per se?
Yeah, but I don't think that's what race is, right? So race is the idea that 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 ancestry, that overall similarity. And so, like, think about like ancestry. Like you and I are like related. We have a great great like grandfather somewhere in common, right? So you can just, if you rank yourself, obviously, your siblings and you are like very similar. If you have identical twins, it's even more, right? But like we all have a score. We don't know what it is, right? But that's sort of how related we are, right? Like, so how far back it is till our relatives are the same people. I think the idea of race is the idea that that type of scoring, an ancestry scoring, is is very well associated with what you're talking about, with selective pressures. And so if you can't have that, right? So like Ray says that those are the same thing, right? And so that's the example about like sickle cell. Sickle cell is an example of they're not, right? Like, yes, all these people are a group. They're the group of people with this, and this matters, right? Like functionally, this can kill you. Like this is super. You have, like, if you have sickle cell, someone else says you have something in common, and you have something in common. You inherited it from the same guy, right? So you have a genetic thing in common. But but if you're a person in Africa with sickle cell, and there's a person from South Africa without sickle cell, and then there's a person in Sri Lanka with sickle cell, are you willing to say like that's my group, right? Now the person in South Africa, and in Africa is kind of different, but let's say in China, the person in China who doesn't have sickle cell definitely shares a last common ancestor more recently with the person in Sri Lanka, right? And so race says that like that analysis of like sort of seeing your similariness in ancestry, that will correlate quite well to the selective pressures that people have been under. And
Hmm.
that so you can't have, I mean, you can have two different things now. right? But race says that they're the same, and they are the same in animals, and they also are the same in humans that are truly separated, right? Because if we're truly separate, like in the new world, like the old world, we have no contact for like 20,000 years, we're going to drift apart. So our DNA is just going to change, right? Now that has no function, but you know the DNA that's not under like any selection will change. So now we can tell us apart, and that what that tells us is, you know, we don't share common ancestors that recently. So that's meaningful. But also, if you're in the new world, and my people are in like the old world for a long enough time, there'll be different selective pressures. So we're going to change
Hmm.
functionally and ancestrally, and so that can happen at the same time. But the question is that happening to a great deal to humans? And if the answer is no, then you don't really have, then like his first comment doesn't matter because, yeah, okay, people, they self-identify. What they're saying is they're saying something about who they think their recent ancestors are. And recent is totally arbitrary, right? Because these like DNA tests, when you do them, they tell you your ancestor, but it's obviously not true, right? Like it's obviously like not true because they have to choose a time to tell you what you want to hear, right? So if you're say a I don't know, if you're an African person who left Africa, you know, you're one of the first people to leave. So like your family's been in the U.S. since 1400, right? So you've been there almost 1,000 years. It's going to tell you that you're from Africa. But if you're French, it's not going to tell you that you're a Gaul, right? It's going to tell you that you're French because you don't want to be told, oh, like, yeah, the French came
Yeah,
like
I mean,
from Gaul. You
what
don't want
is
to hear that,
French?
right? So it's
What is
the
French?
yeah,
When did what's the French were Gauls, right? At the
yeah,
point they were French. At the point in the future there might be something else.
yeah,
So when geneticists in the future, like 1,000 years, are making reference to someone who has ancestry going back, that back, right? Where do they tell you come from? Just like most humans came out of Africa. So why can't your genetics tell you that you're African? Yeah, you're all African. So you
yeah.
have to speak a specific time, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
might
but
be,
each group wants a different time.
and
That's the problem. Like,
yeah.
not all groups want the same time. Like, if you're
Mm,
like African American, you want to know right before slavery. That's what you care about,
mhm,
right? Like, that's what they're asking about. Like, if you're African American, you don't want to know where your ancestors were 3,000 years ago. You want to know where
mm.
they were in, like, maybe like the year like 1300, right? That's what people. But if you're French Canadian, you want to know about France. Like, even if your ancestors have been in Canada for 300 years, that's no. You want to, but then you don't want to know too far back because you want to feel French, right? So it's each group has their own time to pick, and the ancestry companies are going to try to tell you what you want to hear. I mean, I did my ancestry, and I was a high percentage. I think I was 11% Nigerian. I found it shocking.
Ah,
Yeah.
welcome, my brother.
Well, everybody is not everybody, but everybody who has any West African ancestry is Nigerian
Mm.
on these tests,
Yeah, that's the funny thing.
and it's because the
Nigerian is
reference
wait,
panels.
Nigerian is not, it's not an ethnicity, it's not a race, it's not a tribe, it's nothing function it. Nigeria itself is an artificial creation. So when you say this person is of Nigerian descent, what exactly do you refer to? Like some part of Cameroon joined Nigeria, some part of,
Yeah.
so what are you talking about really
Well,
when you
it's
say
it's
Nigeria?
it's it's important, I think, because the New York Times wrote an article about this, and they changed the historic record. So they said, "Oh, all these African Americans are finding out that they're Nigerian." And according to the historic record, the slavery was, it was, I think, the Senegambia River. It wasn't like the majority of slaves taken to the U.S. at least were from like
Mm,
farther west, farther north. And it's like saying it turns out they're all Nigerian. And they even got some historian to say like, oh yeah, there was a fringe theory that said actually maybe they came from Nigeria, maybe the boats got switched, and they just said that must have happened because science. And what it is the reference panels are all Nigerians. So if you're
exactly.
African in DNA, you're either Nigerian or you're Kenyan. It just means that they're not Kenyan, right? Like that was the other choice. They could have been Kenyan, right? But there aren't that many panels in like all over West. And also people move, right? So like it doesn't like
Exactly.
that's the most
So
frustrating
so
thing
so
about
what you
ancestry
call
is there's no such
Nigerian,
thing as an ancestry test. There's only a cousin test,
exactly.
right? Because they don't have your ancestors. They're dead. They're not comparing you to like really old people. They're comparing you to people alive today and saying which people look like you're like distant cousins the most. And then they're
It's
saying,
all
oh, well,
guesswork.
your ancestors, they probably also came from there. But no, maybe like your ancestor was somewhere else. You like no one in your family has like ever been there. But these are the descendants of your ancestors, a different line of your family, went to Nigeria. And then people will go to Nigeria and feel like a kinship with Nigeria. Like, this is where I'm from. Well, it makes you feel good, but it's not true, right? Like it's just. But that's the thing. This idea of ancestry is powerful. People really like it, but it's just, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not.
So
It's
I
not true.
think the game is even rigged from the start in the sense that your inputs are predetermined already. So you're not picking from. It's not. It's not purely. How will I call it? It's not organic. You are
Yeah.
actually picking your reference points.
Yeah.
So
Exactly. Exactly.
when you go to Africa and you pick from Nigeria and pick from Kenya, you've you've sort of predetermined the results that are going to come out. And what's
Yeah.
to say that the person you are picking from in Nigeria, his ancestors were not from somewhere in South Africa
Exactly.
500 years ago?
And
Like,
here's the thing. This is why I think races are like a really bad idea, because you'll fix it when it doesn't correspond to what you think about race. So when you, in the very first results, they had a very small panel, but they actually had some people from Tanzania.
mm,
And then what could happen if you're a Persian American, you could sequence your DNA, and it would tell you that you're from Tanzania. And what it is actually there was a Persian conquest in Tanzania. That's why they still practice Islam there. They have a like a Persian sort of art thing there. So it's actually real that like in the year like 900, a bunch of people from Iran went to Tanzania. So they're a small founder population, and they, like if you look in their DNA, it's fair to call them Persian, I would say, because they, like 5% of like the DNA there is from Iran, right? But if you're from Iran, your ancestors aren't from Tanzania, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like it's just that some
mm.
Persians went there and those guys are related to you. But we know that, and we know that because some Persian guys like, what the hell, Africa? I'm not black. It can't be. So then we go, let's fix that. Let's fix that. Like that's a mistake. It's not a
So
mistake because
imagine if Tanzanians and Iranians looked phenotypically
exactly.
similar.
Then we wouldn't
It would
fix it.
just
That's the
it would
point,
just be
right?
easy
So
to say.
race, like we make the science tell us more about race, because if you do your DNA and it says, oh, you're from Cameroon, you're like, no, I'm not. They're like, yeah, you probably are, right? Just because, who cares? Like, what do you know, right? Like that's the thing, is race is sort of, we fix things when they don't match what we think about race, right? But I'm guarantee you that like you don't know where your ancestors are from, you know where your cousins are today, and that's the best you can do in science. Now, maybe historically you could figure it out. I'm not saying that there's no records, but I'm saying science can't tell you that, right? And so when it's wrong, we fix it, but it's wrong all the time. It's
Wow.
weird that they pulled that one off, calling it ancestry. It's just it's a. I mean, there is some ancestry, but very little. You have to get ancient DNA, right? So there's
Mm,
very little and also if you cluster ancient DNA people, they all cluster away from all of us. So
mm.
they're very weird looking people. Like the ancients from all over the world don't look like us, right? So, and that's interesting. Like why? I don't know, but like they have a pattern where they somewhat match. Like they separate with the like geography, but they separate away from like all of us. So there's like two worlds, and you can see it in the DNA. So
Mm.
that's one that I don't know the answer. Some people think it's batch effect. I don't think it's all batch. I think some of that's real. And like, but you can do Y chromosome, right? So there's a story. I saw this an African American guy, a bunch of them actually, that are descendant of King Tut. You seen this?
No, I haven't. The only crazy one I've seen on Twitter is some white guy telling me that most British men are descended from a most British men are descended from a pharaoh. That's what he said.
Pharaoh.
And I was like,
Well, I mean,
oh,
maybe. I mean, they probably have some of the Pharaoh's DNA in them, but I don't think that makes them different than like anybody else. But yeah, so I think no, I'm sorry, it's not Tut. It's Ramses. Ramses the second. I think that's the guy who his body was actually so well preserved that they got his DNA. And what they ended up doing was they would tell people that your Y chromosome is the same. So they're people. And what's interesting is, and that's why I think race is not something people think well about. So there's this guy, and he finds that he has the Y chromosome of Ramses. And so
mm,
what does he think when he finds that out? He thinks, oh God, Ramses was black. And that's what's so interesting to me. It's like, well, I get it, right? You're black. This is your ancestor, so therefore he's
Mm.
black.
So he's
And
black.
right, like, but like that's true. Like if you were a squirrel, and your ancestor, and you have an ancestor, probably also a squirrel, right? Like if you think about if you believe in race, and like that's what I'm saying. That why I think that we shouldn't believe in race because that's what believing in race does, right? It makes you think like that, and it's sad because like yeah, it's not wrong. It's not wrong that his Y chromosome comes from Ramses. Like, I'm not saying that's a mistake, but you know him and a couple of like million other people around the world have this.
Mm.
Like I mean, Ramses is famous because I think he had like a hundred kids. So I mean, there's a lot of descendants, and then they went all over the world, right? And it's but the idea that that's my ancestor, that person has my race, that's not how it works. Not even a little bit. Like it's just none, right? So it's just that's why I think that yeah, I think the ancestry stuff's interesting. I think that race, if anything, holds us back in science because
Mm.
it causes us to, for example, when we do, I don't know if you know what PRS is, but we'll do PRS, and then there's a PRS that they did in Europe, and then do you know what that is? PRS? Have you heard the term?
PRS? No, no, I
So it's
haven't.
polygenic risk scoring. So this idea that you can look at your DNA and then you can figure out figure out like how tall you are or like your educational attainment. The educational attainment's huge. That's the one people really care about. There was just a paper published on ancient Rome and educational attainment PRS scores, which is it was really funny because they had like a couple hundred people, and the argument is that Rome fell apart because their PRS for educational attainment went down, right? But basically, you can do like the best PRS around is probably height, right? It's probably going to predict it best. Now you don't need to do PRS for like eye color because there's not that many
Mm.
alleles. So you don't need to do PRS for whether you have like sickle cell, for example. It's just one allele, right? But height is weird because it's genetic, but there isn't one allele. There's hundreds. But you can explain, and it's not great. You can explain maybe 20% of the variance of how tall you are based on your genes. But you apply the same model, those same variants to people in Africa, and it predicts that they're all incredibly short. And so people were like, well, that's crazy because the African people have different ancestry groups, so that must be why
Mm.
it doesn't work. But a lot of it is just that what this PRS is actually pulling out, like what's it pulling out, we don't know. And a lot of it is people who are tall in Europe are from Denmark and they're from Northern Europe. People who are short are from Italy and they're from Southern Europe. And so a lot of these variants that are telling you how tall you are really just like telling you that you're not Danish. And Italians are not very Danish. And you know who's even more not Danish than Italians is Africans. Really not Danish. But like if you think about it, people in Africa are from Southern Europe, right? So if the Southern Europeans are the shortest, and you apply it to the Africans, well, they're really Southern Europeans, right? So they're going to be called even shorter. And so now we finally have some people who have looked at, for example, like PRS scores for like England and Ireland, and people that are genetically really similar, and they see that you still have the same problem. You still will have the problem where same ancestry
Mm.
group, things you take a thing on one group, you apply it to another, it won't work. And it's just because most of what you're pulling out to give you signal isn't causal. But race distracts us, right? Because we think if it doesn't work across race, we think it's because of race. Always, every time.
So
So,
I want to bring in the aspect of phenotype, right?
mm-hmm.
Because we've been talking at the molecular level all this while. But I think, to be fair, let's bring in. I want to give phenotype just as much weight as the other stuff that we don't see, but you can use scientific analysis to pass out. If you look at someone who is from Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, there are certain phenotypical features that are similar. If you look at some people from Southeast Asia, you're going to find certain phenotypes that are similar. If you look at people from Africa, you're going to find certain phenotypes that are similar. So, based on those phenotypical characteristics themselves, which are preponderant in groups that self-identify with themselves, that claim a similar descent, similar ancestry, even if you dig deep in, you might find something else different, right? can't can't we say that race is legitimate on that grounds based on what we observe? People who say they come from the same place typically look the same way, typically you know, have certain phenotypical characteristics that are similar. So can't we say because of that occurrence that yes, we can say this is a distinct group that we might even want to call a race?
I mean, that's what they do um, in Brazil, for example. I don't know if you've been there, but that they have phenotypical race only, and they also have a lot of admixture. So what they have is they can have in one family two brothers, and one is black and one is white. That isn't strange to them. And there's a famous saying in Brazil. Actually, it's like an anti racist thing. It's saying that just because your grandmother's black, that doesn't make you not racist. And in the U.S., that doesn't make sense to us because to me, it's like, well, no, it does because it makes you black. So then it can't be, right? Like to us, that does. And to them, and now to us, people say, like, just because your wife's black, or just because your friend's black, that doesn't make you not racist,
Hmm.
right? But having a grandmother or like your mom, like that does work for us. But for them, the argument is like, no, like having a wife would make you not racist. Having a grandmother doesn't mean anything because just because your grandmother's black, that doesn't mean you are. You could have came out white, and you can still be
Hmm.
like
Yep.
totally racist, right? So yeah, but I don't think that like what they're doing in Brazil, they're describing something, and they could. I mean, they can be racist, I guess, but they're not. That's not what we have, right? It's a completely different idea. Like we have something that is lineage based, and so yeah, you could have a phenotypic class. I think that yeah, you could do it on height. You could do it on yeah. I mean, you can do it purely on skin color, right? There are definitely skin colors real. You could make dark, light, and medium. I mean, three races, right? You can do that. I just think that that's not what we think that race is. You can say like that part of race is legitimate, but that's not the part. But like race is the concept of race is that these two parts come together, right? Is that is A and B are the same, right? Otherwise, like of course, all the parts of race by themselves are legit, but that then you don't need it, right? Because the concept is these have to say the same thing, right? And I don't think they do. But yeah, I mean, I mean, like I saw what you said about different tribes and different groups and how people can still be racist. I think, yeah, I don't think that like I think that like people in Nigeria definitely don't have the same concept of race. There isn't racial strife like there is in the U.S. At least not on not on the races that we have. That's for sure true, right? And you're saying, well, even without race, we can still have very similar problems. Yeah, it's true. Um, but you're just naming it. If it's the exact same race, you might just be naming the same thing. You might just be like using race by a different word. Like so, for example, in Pakistan, I have a friend from there, and he told me that you can drink in Pakistan if you're Christian. And my friend, his parents are Muslim, but he doesn't really like believe in God or anything, right? He's not a religious guy. I was like, yeah, but like you don't care about that. He's like, no, I can't. And I was like, what? And his passport says his religion. So he can't buy alcohol. Like he legally can't buy it, right? So like, is that racial discrimination? I don't know. I mean, he's born with this thing and he can't change it. He can't say like, oh, I don't believe in this. So for them, you can recapitulate race as religion. I think race is this idea that like there's this meaningful thing that you were born with that like this phenotype tells you who you're like related to. And I think with tribe and culture, I think it might have part of that, but I think there's also the part that's real. Like most tribes have a language, so that's like a real thing, right? So saying like you want to be around people from your tribe is like I want to be around people that speak the same language I spoke as a kid. Like there's a real thing there. And the question to me that if you if you find out that your friend find out that your cousin is actually adopted at the hospital, would you get rid of him? Would he no longer be if he speaks the same language? Then it's race, right? And there's probably a little bit of that, right? Some people that are tribal take it to race, but like race is sort of that, like that's the extension. And I do think, yeah, because of the U.S.'s role um, in the world, in our obsession with race,
Hmm.
it is important because it's like we were saying, like they're gonna fix the Tanzanian thing because it doesn't match the race in the U.S., but they're not gonna fix it for some person in Africa. It's like I know those aren't my people, right? So race sort of
Hmm.
is predominant because this the West cares about it so much.
Okay, so let's talk about race and IQ,
Okay.
right? So IQ, intelligent quotient, whatever the hell it is. and groups and quote unquote race. Let's pretend that race exists. Let's pretend that we all believe that there are certain races. So, human traits are genetically, they are hereditary, right? So, we inherit the ability to walk, to talk. Our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, don't have that functionality because of their hereditary, right? So, if almost everything functional to us is inherited,
I mean, no, but I mean, parrots can talk. Parrots are our last common ancestor with parrots is like 200 million, like 200 like million
yeah,
years
yeah.
ago. So
So the point I
not
was
always.
trying to make is that
Yeah,
there are certain things that are distinctly human,
yeah,
and they stem from our DNA, they stem from our lineage or hereditary, right? There are things that makes us distinctively human, right?
mm-hmm.
So if those things, if it is true that our ability to do certain things is based on our inheritance, why can't it be true also that something that like IQ is hereditary, and if you want to break it down by groups, that different groups might have different IQs in terms of you know I don't know really how to put it
Yeah. I mean,
in
so
terms of
I would say like, okay, so this is complicated. So there's two problems I have with this. The first
okay.
is I reject IQ as like height. Now height isn't perfect. There are people with congenital like dwarfism, and they're really
Hmm.
really short, and that's a single mutation. It's autosomal dominant. So it's not like sickle cell, where if you have one copy, you're a dwarf. If you have two
Mm,
copies, you're not alive. Like you can't live. You don't make it, right? So
mm,
that's an example where like you could have the genetics to be incredibly tall, but you get this dwarf mutation and you'll be very very short. And then there's some defects, and there's growth hormone diseases that you probably heard of that make people incredibly tall. But those are just the outliers, right? And the vast majority of people, their height is sort of predicted by many many genes, and there's going to be sort of like in so it's going to sort of go along with their like recent group. So like people from Denmark are taller than people in like Italy. That's true, right? Like so now that doesn't mean there's more dwarfs in Italy. It doesn't mean there's more giants in Denmark, because those, again, the genetic basis for those is not the same, right? But it does mean that on average people are, and that average is meaningful, right? So when you say things are on average different, like one thing, like why does that matter? It only matters if the average is sort of informative, right? So it depends on the distribution. So whether the average matters requires you to know the distribution. Now, if it's a nice, like normal distribution, then the average is important. If it's not, then the average might not be important, right? And so I'm not convinced that that IQ is well approximated as a polygenic trait. And by that, I'm saying like I'm just not convinced that IQ exists. I think what does exist is incompetence. There are incompetent people. I mean, I've tutored a lot. So I train people for the MCAT. I train people for the like LSAT, the SAT. I've done every standardized test, and I've trained people at all of them. And that does inform like my opinion a little bit. And I do admit, this is probably like one of my more, I guess, I don't know if it's right wing, but like I admit that beyond just people that are clearly impaired. So the people that are like really impaired, they have like Down syndrome, or they have something where they're not going to be able to sort of like make it through school, right? But then there probably are people that have some lower level of incompetence, and they're unable to like learn stuff. Now, I don't know if that can be fixed with better early childhood development. I don't know, but I just think that that's a minority of people. It's a really small like minority of people, and so I don't think that IQ or intelligence is one thing. I just don't think it's one thing. And so I think incompetence is sort of, it might not be one thing, but it looks like one thing. It manifests as one thing, right? But so I don't think that like, and so I don't think that's why I don't think group IQ is that useful. Like Bo Weingart, I had a debate with him, and he was trying to, I said, well, like, we made all these different points about, like your culture, and like how you're affected, and I don't know if you heard of the story of Jaime Escalante. Have you heard about him?
no.
So this is a digression, but it's an important story. Yeah, I'll tell it quick. So it's a guy from Venezuela. He went to East LA, and he went to a high school there, and he was kind of a hard ass. and he decided to teach these kids calculus. And this is a school where like they hardly graduate. It's a really bad school. They're all in gangs. It's classic American story of a bad school in a bad neighborhood. And there's a movie about it that sensationalizes it a little bit, but the truth is he got these kids to pass. So in America we have like our major standardized tests, and we have sort of these advanced placement ones that not everyone takes, and they're much harder because the SAT you're competing against not everybody but a lot of kids. Well, a lot of kids take it and do really bad, so you just have to beat them to do good. But these like advanced placement test and calculus, you don't have to take that. You don't take it unless you think you're going to pass. So like taking that is hard. And he got these kids in his class where they'd never had a kid take this before. He got these kids. I think the first year he got like 18 to pass. The next year he got like 30 to pass. His final year he got like 80 to pass. And it's a famous story because the testing board didn't believe it. They thought that they cheated. And people said that's because they're racist. But to be fair, it's also because like the school's never had a kid pass ever, and now it has 50. Like, what's the chance? So they made them retake the test. And they retook the test and they passed it. I mean, maybe one cheated, but they retook the test and almost all of them, they passed the test again. And so it's the story of this guy who basically like just didn't care and was like going to force these kids to learn. And I mean, I have a personal connection to it because one of those students in his class, one of those students was my teacher. So that's where I learned calculus. So like I learned from her, and she was not a normal teacher. I remember like, this is in college, so I was just a different person. Like I didn't really think education really mattered the same way back then. I remember like, she was like, you have to take like differential equations. Like, yeah, I can't, I work. Like the class met at a certain time and I had to work. I worked at a gym. I made like, like $8 an hour. But to me, I was like, I have to work, And she was like, okay, I'll give you a ride after class so you can make it to work. So I had to take the bus. So like, I'd go to her class, and as soon as like class would end, she'd give me a ride to work. It was like she was insane. Like she just wouldn't let you fail. So it was like that. So like, there are these points where it's like if IQ was this sort of group trait, these Hispanic and Black people in East LA, according to all these group studies, their average IQ, I don't know what it is, but it's low, right? So it's 80, 85. The idea that you could go from 0 and then 1 year you have 50 of them pass this advanced placement test, which according to people that believe in IQ is associated with like an IQ of like 120. That does statistically isn't possible. It isn't possible if that's true, right? And yes, he did select kids and he kicked out the bad kids out of his class. It wasn't like he did this for every kid. There's 1,000 kids and he chose like 30. But it can't. That still shouldn't happen, right? So, and then his final point was like, yeah, but what if we did the averages and whatever, black and white? We just asked you what you identify as, and that's fine, sure. And then what if Black people were still 2 points below the white people? It's like, I mean, yeah, maybe. Like that really doesn't bother me. Like, okay, like I think there's a straw man when people say like people believe that all like people that are skeptical of like Charles Murray's claim that we have to believe that all people of all races would get the same average on a test. No, that's stupid. Like that doesn't make sense, right? Like it doesn't bother me, this idea that like if he wants to take pride, like for example, here's a question: who's taller, Black or white people?
I don't know.
But they're not the same, right? If you went around the world, you measured every person that thinks they're Black and every person that thinks they're white, you get 2 numbers. They're not the same, right? But who cares, right? Like it really doesn't. Like if you told me white or taller, like I don't think I would have no pride in either answer. Like I just don't care because but like some Black people are really tall. Some white people are really tall, and that matters a lot. But the average just isn't meaningful because there's also some whole groups of Black people that are all incredibly short.
So I think this is the problem with statistics. I remember this famous quote that says, "There are lies, damned lies, and then there are statistics." Right? People will use statistics for whatever thing they want to do, and it really irks me when people use like the average or like the median, right? You try to make something meaningful out of it, right? Yeah, there are people above this average, there are people below this average. So why are you taking the average to represent that group?
Mm-hmm.
If the average is what is functional to that group, right? If that's what defines that group, that people are above that invalidates the point you're trying to
Well,
make.
no, I would say it depends on the distribution of that group. Sometimes the average can be meaningful, right? It also depends on the like distance away, right? It's like the average height of a giraffe pretty meaningful, right? Because like it's taller than the tallest human, right? I mean,
Mhm.
but again, any statistic would matter for the giraffe. The
Yeah,
max height, the mid
but
height,
the
the
thing is
average
that
height, the median,
there is no hum
they would all be tall.
there is no human that is as tall as a giraffe. So if there were cases where you
No,
had
but there
some
are
humans
groups,
as
right? So
tall as
like
the
if you go
giraffe,
to like Kenya and Mbuti, the people who are on average like 5 feet tall, men.
no. So the point I'm trying to make is that the groups you are comparing in the first place, there are some that are above that average, that are just as high as the group whose average is so high,
Yeah,
right? So if it's even a possibility that someone from that group can get as as high, even if it's just one person or two persons that
hmm,
can get as high as that of the person from the other group who has a high average, what
yeah,
does that tell you? Does
yeah.
that tell you that it's something definite about that group?
Oh yeah, no,
Doesn't.
for sure. Yeah, it's not determinative at all. Of course not. Yeah, no, I mean that's for sure. But the point is that sometimes averages are meaningful, and then sometimes they're not. And I think they're often not. Like for height, it's just not meaningful. Like knowing who's taller, black, even if it's like it could be a lot, it could be a whole inch. And that's a lot, right? Like it could be let's say that I, on average, black or white are 2 inches. I still don't care. It just doesn't matter to me at all because like now with because there are groups within those groups that are just so different, right? So it's not meaningful to know someone's race, to know their height. Like it just doesn't tell me anything, and it doesn't mean that the means are the same, right? So like not always having different averages means something. And like with IQ, it's why are they different if they are different? Like so, for example, I did a study. It was a small data set, and I say this mostly for an example, but basically, it was a full data set from a hospital. And in this data set, Latino people, Hispanic people, whatever you want to call them, had the lowest IQ on average, much lower. And I just tell people that, and I see like, what do you think that means? Like, okay, that's interesting. Why? And I'll tell you why. Because they had the higher incidence of trisomy, right? Like Down syndrome. So they had a higher percentage of kids that
Mm.
had very, very low IQ because of Down syndrome, which is a congenital disorder. And what causes that? Well, it's associated with a few things, but the strong association is the age of the mother. So
So
basically,
that skews the data.
these people are Catholic, and they had the women have kids when they're a little older. They don't use as much birth control or whatever. Who knows? But they have older moms. So this group is having kids when they're older, and so they have a higher. It's still not high. It's 1.5% instead of 0.5%, but it's enough to bring down the average. But it's saying like, is that meaningful? Because if you don't have Down syndrome, then who cares, right? Like, what it turns out that there's a higher percentage of them with Down syndrome, but all the ones who don't have it just don't have it. So it's like, for example, if I told you that black people on average in West Africa have lower quality blood, and I said, oh, it's because like 5% of them have sickle cell, so on average their blood is low quality. But all the people that don't have that, the 95%, it doesn't
Mm.
matter to them, right? It doesn't matter at all. And so I think that's what you see is that when we understand something, like we understand sickle cell, once you understand it, genetics kind of makes race obsolete. Because, yeah, maybe if I had to, I don't know, get a blood transfusion from somebody and I only knew their race, and like in this world where like I know there's a higher incidence in this one race in this one place, then you want the blood from the white person because you think there's a lower chance you'll get sickle cell. But in today's world, you just ask if they have sickle cell, right? Because we have DNA now. So anything functional, right? Either we don't understand it, which I think is somewhat true about IQ. We don't know exactly what makes someone like intelligent. We don't know if there's a. We know that there's genetics that make you. I don't want to use this word, but stupid or incompetent. Right? We know that there are like genetics that make your brain not develop. We don't really understand anything genetic about intelligence. We just don't. So maybe that's just because it's just not. It's not something that is like there isn't a genetic like basis for intelligence at all, or if there is, we'll figure it out. And if we ever figured it out, it'd be functional. So then we wouldn't need to know your race because we would just know whether you have this trait. And that would be a functional analysis. So like the idea of race being useful is this: you have to pretend that you're in this place where like I know this is functional, I know it's genetic, but I have no idea how it works. Well, I don't think that place is big. I don't think it's big at all. So But yeah, I think the race and IQ thing is, it's just one of those things where it's that I, to be fair to those people, I think that I don't know if it's true across the world, but I do want to say one thing that I do have. I feel that some of why they're sort of angry and they're speaking out and they want to talk about these hard truths is because I think there was sort of a pact, not a full pact, but I felt like at some point, it's just like you said, if your race doesn't determine you, then you don't get to think about it. That just seemed like the fair rule, right? It seemed like the fair rule that we get to say, like, okay, like if it's not determinative, like it doesn't matter. So if you're an immigrant and like your people are poor and they're like, I don't know, they have a higher incidence of crime, it doesn't matter because that doesn't mean you do. So I don't, right, I have to just take you as you are, right? Because it doesn't mean anything about you specifically. And that's sort of the pact to make people, that's, I feel like that's the only way to get along in like a pluralistic society. It's the only way, right? Is that like you have to treat people as like individuals, right? It works. And it is kind of a deal for the minority group, because if the minority group has less money, has higher crime rates or something, the people are sort of agreeing to do this thing, even though if they did the other thing, like maybe their group would get favorable treatment. But I think what's happened now is all the groups are vying for favorable treatment. And so you have people saying like, oh, we need less white men, we need this. So it's like people are now fighting about it. And it's sad because I think that pact's super important. Like you just don't want, but once you lose it, I think it's hard. And I don't think it only comes from the race IQ people. I think they're emboldened by it, but I don't think they started, or they probably started originally, but I don't think that the revival is just purely that they just woke up and decided to revive this. I think that they feel that people are gonna try to make statements based on race. So like, okay, I'm gonna make them too, right? And I think they're all fraud. They're all wrong. But I think to be fair, like I'll see the exact same research done, and there'll be exact different conclusions. Like in the U.S., there'll be a paper showing how people that are Republican. It's not even true. It's counties where they vote Republican. It's the weakest link. But anyway, counties where they vote Republican, blah 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 blah, has higher rates of death from COVID. And they'll say like, look at these idiots, look at these Republicans, don't believe in vaccines, what clowns. And then you'll see like very similar, and it's also true that like these Republican counties, like in deep South, like Alabama, like Mississippi, they have the least healthcare, the worst diets, the most obesity, highest rates of smoking. So they have all the like they're the most poor by far. So they have all the sort of diseases of poverty. But you're making fun of them because they're Republican. And then you'll see another similar analysis. And also, if you want to talk about it, in Mississippi, a lot of them, like a lot of these, because this is not done on voters, it's done in the county. A lot of these like counties in the South have a lot of black people. But they're focusing on the fact that these counties voted Republican. And then you'll see the same study. And it'll be almost the same, but now they'll do one on people who are black and COVID. And there'll be these worse outcomes. And they'll say, look at this evidence of racism. But it's the same thing. You're trying to take a group of people and saying they died more of this disease. And you can either laugh at them or you can say, look at what someone else is doing to them. And it's just same data, right? So it's just, sure, it could be both. But I mean, there's an interesting way that people look at data and they come up with a story. And it's frustrating as a statistician because nowadays I can teach classes now just by asking my students to point out all the mistakes in the news because there's so many. Have you heard of the
That class is
racial
never going to.
the
That class is
racial
never going to end.
have you heard of the racial quintiles? That's my new one that I'm really angry about.
Racial what?
Racial quintiles.
No, I haven't heard of that.
So they'll take people in a race. So they'll take like say black women and they'll separate them quintile five quintiles, right? So bottom 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, like 60, 80, 80. So and they'll put you in a quintile for your race. And then they'll do the same thing to white women. And then they'll say take the middle quintile and they'll analyze it for some outcome, I don't know, like deaths in the hospital, something. And they'll say, look, the white women are doing way better. Even middle-class white women are doing better than middle-class black women. So therefore, it's not class, it's racism. But they don't mention that the middle quintile is not the same amount of money. They never tell you that. And this new trick. And as soon as like people start to do this, they're all doing this. They're like, you have to really read the papers. You have to like read the fine print. You're like, wait a second, quintiles per race. So that means that the median, the people in like the middle quintile aren't making the same amount of money. So you're comparing a black person who makes say 30,000 or something, and a white person makes like 60. You're saying if there's a disparate like outcome there, it can't be class. But I mean, you pick groups of people who make different amounts. And you're saying it's not money, and what's crazy about this is people used to do this in the old days to sort of promote racism. They would say, look, even black people in the fourth quintile, the second to the highest one, have higher crime rates than white people in like the second quintile. Without telling you that, yeah, that's the same. That's the same amount of money, right?
Mm.
And so now they're doing it sort of to fight racism. It's dishonest all the way around. That's why I
Yeah,
think race is bad.
like I saw an article on Twitter, the racial inequality of sleep, and
Oh, really?
yep, maybe I'll share it with you later. And one of the conclusions they said was that there are so many factors, there are so many theories as to why this racial inequality of sleep exists, but that they've adjusted for class. That even with the adjustment for class, that the disparity is still there. So
Yeah,
it's most likely going to
yeah,
be racism.
yeah. And I bet they adjusted for within race like quintiles. I would not be surprised. Yeah,
And I'm like, what?
yeah. It is a crazy thing. I mean, it feels like conspiratorial sometimes. The like how dumb it is. It feels like you can't really believe this. Like, you can't really believe this is like at all meaningful. But I mean, supposedly people do. So, but
Yeah.
it just seems like how could you fall for this? You know?
Yeah. So I think the real pandemic is a pandemic of stupidity because millions of people who fall for things like this, millions on every side,
Yeah, I
on
know.
the left, on the right, it's
No,
it's
there's no
very
happiness
disheartening.
nowhere politically. It really does suck. It's true. And that's something I had to accept because I was always, I worked for Obama. I was like a big supporter of him. And then when he went but I have a question. So how do Nigerians feel about him?
About Obama.
Yeah.
He's American. Phil is an American, and yeah, of course, the name is a Black American, but nothing special,
Because
nothing
in
special,
South
nothing
Africa is
sinister.
interesting. In I've been to a few places in Africa where like the Obama thing, it makes me a little sad actually because I feel like when Obama was elected,
Mm,
there was like a real good feeling, right? There's a real good feeling
mm,
about like how cool that is that like he's the president of the
mm,
U.S. But
mm.
then like what he did like in like Libya and Somalia, there's just like it just doesn't matter, right? And I think that's like sort of the last time that I don't want to call people stupid because I think that sort of kind of woke me up, right? Because when Obama was elected, I was like, I mean, he can't be that bad, right? Like he's black, like he's not going to be like. I mean, in some sense, he's the best example of the fact that race does it because he can be just as bad as everybody else, man. Like
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
what I think that we should have learned that, but instead we got more obsessed with race. But I think Obama kind of,
Mm,
there's always this thing where people would say, yeah, if we ever somehow got a black president, it would be different. And it turns out that's not true,
yeah, yeah,
But I mean, but so and I think like I think he definitely had some capital in Africa, in the whole continent. I think he wasted like a lot of that, which I think is bad because there's
yeah.
just this feeling that man, Obama should have been. But I mean, that's not who he is, right? And it's racist in a way to expect him to be that. But
Mhm.
it is surprising that like that's just he's just the same as all of them. But yeah, the pandemic of stupidity is a. I don't want to call them I don't want to call them stupid, but yeah, there's a pandemic of. I think it's just that when you believe something, unless you're really interested in statistics, you're like really obsessed with this thing, science is sort of just like it's like a religion, right? It's just like a preacher agreeing with you. It's like if you like slightly believe in God and you believe something, and then your priest also says, yeah, you know what? That's in the Bible. Like you don't really check. It's like, oh, I feel better about that. I think that's what the scientist is. It's just kind of like a priest, kind of co-signing, giving you more weight to your
Mm,
belief. But like
mm.
you're gonna believe it no matter what, right? Like so, I think that a
So
lot of the times
basically,
that's
confirmation bias.
Yeah, I mean an insane one, right? And but I think scientists, and then I think also, to be fair, I think the media is pretty insane about this. Like the media will take, like I haven't written that many important scientific papers, but the few that I've written and then end up in the media, it's like there's actually there's something, it's called the what's it called, the Gell-Mann hypothesis. It's made up by a physicist and an economist or economist guy, and they were talking about how when you read the newspaper, when you're really an expert in something, so if you're really an expert in statistics or physics, you read an article about your field, you realize like everything's wrong, everything's wrong, and then you realize, wait a second, all the things that I'm not an expert on,
How
maybe that's
wrong are
also
they?
wrong too. Like, why would it only be my thing? Like, it's like I just happen to know a lot about this thing, and I realized that like the way the media writes about it is all wrong. So maybe everything's wrong, which is depressing, but it's probably not that false, right? That like the way that the media tells you, the media is telling you stories, not really telling you what is, And if you like those stories, like those stories. But I think they're telling you events and stories, and that's it. But like once the media tells you why, like the word why is not, you can't get that from the news, man. Why stuff happens. You can get maybe what happens, but not why. And that's the thing, like the sleep thing. I'm sure they're going to tell you why. It doesn't make it true, But yeah, there's I hope I hope it gets better. I don't know. We'll see. Do you think it'll get better?
I don't know. I frankly, but I think it will get to a tipping point that a lot of people just wake up to the realities that this is not a healthy social environment. And I think I'm beginning to see it a bit even on Twitter, like this left leading people as thank you, Jenk and Anna Kasparian. I've of late they've been okay. They've been sort of more centrist. They've been even criticizing their own side, like, okay, this doesn't make sense. And I see some people on the right doing something similar. So I think the madness will get to a head, and most people will just like, what the hell are we doing? Yeah. But I just hope that we don't burn down the house before we get to that point.
Yeah, I kind of think maybe America is just needs to take a page from like some other countries or something. That's what I honestly
Yeah.
think. Because at least I wasn't there for long, but I was with a bunch of people from like Uganda, and I felt like they were all the scientists, but there was the energy there, a focus on like, who cares? Let's work. Like there was less that I feel like the U.S. hasn't had for a while, right? Where like these countries are a little bit younger, not just in Asian people, but like the people are just like, they want to work and they want to figure things out, and they're not really worried about like what it means or like what it means to this population. Like just let's just work, like let's just, in science that's really important, that you just want to be motivated, be energetic, and let's get something done, man. Like that's what like really matters. And so I think maybe the US is it does feel sometimes stagnant. I think one thing that I've noticed on the online discourse thing is that people really respect science, which I appreciate as a scientist, but it's one thing that you guys, I think, if you're not a scientist, especially, is that you don't realize how hierarchical that science is. Like it's so, even though people in science identify as sort of left, there's nothing this it's way worse than anything in politics. Like every scientific institution that you can think of, whether it's getting a grant or writing a paper or getting a promotion, there's these committees, right? So like to get a grant, you submit a big grant and it goes to a study section, and all these scientists read it. They're supposed to be your peers, and they give the score, and then all the grants are scored, and then there's like a percentage score. So if you get a low score, like the top 20%, there's a better chance that you'll get funded, right? Same thing, like when you read a paper, it's supposed to go to peer review, and then they give a recommendation, and then if the reviewers like it, it's supposed to get published. But also, it can just not. People don't realize that there's always like a boss. Like if it's the editor of the journal or it's the government in the case of the grants, there's always somebody, and they have
It's not
absolute
totally
power.
objective. It's
They
not
have
totally
absolute
objective.
power to say no or yes, no matter how bad or good everyone else thinks, and they don't have to tell you, which is
Mhm.
crazy. Like you don't get to know. Like sorry, no is, and it's weird that they don't give this up, right? So I feel like it's an interesting institution because it's people that are sort of left leaning, but when people get to the top and they have absolute power, there's never someone saying, maybe we should make it so you can't reject it if it gets above this. Or, kind of like, President Biden can veto something unless 2/3 like it, right? So like, okay, he has power, but not absolute. Like if 2/3 of I think is it the Senate, or maybe it's 60 votes. I guess is it 60? I don't know. So I think 60 votes is veto proof, or that's filibuster proof. I don't even know. But the point is, like, there's a percentage of people. If that many support it, he can't say no. And then, like, that doesn't exist in science. Science, there's so many of our systems. There's a guy at the top, and that guy, and that's an interesting thing. Seeing this affirmative action debate, to me, I find it really interesting seeing this. And then there's this backlash about sort of old white men, right? And I find it fascinating because, yeah, it's true. Like, there's these old white men primarily, and they have a ton of power. And it's like, but the impetus isn't like, yeah, let's change that. The impetus is like, let's get some of our people to have that absolute power. Like, let's get some dictators that look like us. But like, maybe dictators are bad. Like, maybe we just shouldn't have class, like a society ruled by people with like absolute power who can do whatever the hell they want. Like, maybe that's not a good idea. But the whole affirmative action debate, to me, is a debate where nobody's thinking about the fact that Harvard is a crazy idea. I mean, what was your take on that? You were against, like, you were pro the ruling?
Well, I was pro the ruling, but with you know, first of all, I thought that race wasn't so significant to begin with in the admissions process. So those who were just bitching about affirmative action, any black person who's got into the school has to be by affirmative action. I thought that was hyperbolic because Harvard was choosing from a pool of highly qualified students to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So the black students that they picked from were qualified by other criteria. So maybe race was a tipping factor, but it wasn't the dominant factor. So on that ground, I thought the other side was making a noise about nothing. Then on the flip side, why even use race in the first place? It just muddies the water. It just brings into question so many things, right? So remove it. I don't mind. I don't care if I think I think it's counterproductive to have even factored race into it in the first place. But I do understand the necessity of why race-based affirmative action came into effect in the first place, given the history of the US, given the fact that yes, we can see race is not real, but it was a real thing constructed in America, and you could have certain disadvantages because of the way you looked based on the color of your skin. So if a problem was caused because of the way you looked, doesn't it follow logically that certain solutions that apply you giving you a hand because of the way you look might also be in order, right? But like the Supreme Court justices argued, I think Roberts argued that there should be a time limit to this. There should be it shouldn't be something that goes on forever, right? So in that sense, I think affirmative action, the idea behind it to begin with was okay, was good. Implementation became another thing, right? Maybe it got derailed along the way, but even at that, it wasn't as bad as some on the right were making it to be. So
I think it
that's my
depends
point.
on the institution, actually, for that to be true, right? So at
Yeah.
like MIT in 2020, they got rid of the standardized test. They got rid of the math test because they wanted more diversity. And then the next year, they brought it back because people were failing. People were failing. They weren't, and that's because at MIT, like, if you don't know math and they let you in, and if you read like the old literature, like the Thomas Sowell
Mm.
stuff, he talks about this, how like affirmative action causes people to fail, right? Because if you allow someone to go to MIT but they can't pass the math test to get into MIT, you're not helping them.
But that's fundamentally racist itself. To think that the way to get a more diverse student body is to remove something that would be beneficial for that's a necessary skill. So it's assuming that black people or other people do not have that necessary skill. That skill that is necessary, you have to take it
Yeah.
away for you to get
Yeah, but
them
it's
into the
interesting. So
institution.
it's funny how, and I think knowing that as a black person, it does hurt you. Like it hurts
Yeah.
you mentally. It's psychological. Like so, like I can tell you my own experience. I haven't told a lot of people this, but when I was an undergrad, they would send us to these like programs, and this was a form of affirmative action because there were some white people there, but it was mostly, I mean, a lot of like African like immigrants were there. Like they were probably the dominant like black group, but like there was a lot of Hispanics were there. They would send us to like they would have programs from kids from like the inner city, but also race, definitely a big part of it. And they would send you basically for the summer to like do research on a college campus, right? So that way, like this is when you're an undergrad, kind of sort of in the idea they were trying to push people into graduate school. They wanted to make more PhDs, more people of color in PhDs. So you would go like do this research. And when I went to graduate school, it's because I went to one of these. I went to one of these programs, and then I did well there, and then I applied to the school, and I got in, and it was really hard the first year. Everyone was from China. Everyone was so good at math. Like I remember there was a kid who I was trying to help because I felt bad for him because he was always sleeping in class. I thought he was going to fail. And like the first day, the first test came back, and like, he got every single question right. And I was like, oh, okay, so I guess you know more than me. Yeah, it was really humbling. And then I just remember that I had a classmate. She was a year below me, right? So she a year after me, and she was in that same program with me. And then she was going to apply. So she was going to go there the next. I was kind of happy because I was, oh, I'm a friend. Yeah, that's cool. And I remember talking to her, and then time came around, and she was like black, Hispanic. She had like she was female, so she checked all the boxes, right? And then I was like, and then she didn't get in, and I was like, what? And I was just like, because affirmative action, it's very hard for you to believe it's the tipping point because you feel like you're there because of some preference. It's hard. You don't know how much it is. And then she didn't get in. I was like, that must be a mistake. Like I was so confident that like, no, like you're the right race and stuff. Like they're gonna let you in. Like that makes sense. Like you're exactly what they want. They want more women. They want more of this. Like you're what they want. And she didn't get in. And then I told her to email the director. I was like, email the guy. He must have like tell him like, you remember me? Like, and then she did. And he emailed her back, and he was just like, sorry if you didn't get 800 on the math jury. Like, it's just we don't accept that. And I was like, whoa. And I hate to say this because I feel bad because I mean she went on to get a PhD so much, she's fine. But in a way I was like, it almost helped me because I was like, oh, okay. There was like a thing. It's not that hard to get a perfect score on that test because it's just algebra. But like the idea is this is a PhD program and they're just like, if you're not really damn good at algebra, you can't get in. And I think she probably would have been fine there to be honest. But like points out that they had this standard and that they didn't actually bend it for me. And I was like, oh, okay, like oh, I didn't realize that because again, yeah, like that was my imagination of what it is like they're gonna want you, so they want you. But that was affirmative action. A lot of affirmative action back then, so this is like early 2000s, was like this, where like, and that makes sense to me. I think that yeah, now that I've gotten older, I don't know how much it matters what color people are, but I don't think it's really for me to judge. Like if you want to have more Nigerians, you want more people in your tribe to get PhDs, okay, and you want to go and train them so that way they get there, it's fine, right? Like that's how you do it, right? If you want, it might be weird to me that like you're so obsessed with people who like look a certain way, but it's who cares, right? Like you can do whatever the hell you want, and maybe I mean it's probably not a bad thing, right? So but that's what it was. And I had some friends who went to this magnet school, these guys, and they went to MIT. They played football there, which was hilarious because like nobody plays football there, but they like they just did anyway. But like the programs were sort of geared at training like black people, like training people, making them really good, and then they get in. And then some of the schools got lazy. But what's interesting about the Harvard case is they don't have the mismatch problem, right? So Harvard didn't have the mismatch. So Harvard didn't have. I mean, you can look at the failure rates; they're not identical, but you don't have really high failure rates for all the black students. So if you're changing the standard, you're lowering the standard for the black people, and they're not failing out, then you don't need the standard. So the racism is actually that they're forcing Asian people to do well on the standard. That's what I think people don't realize. Like that's the racism is that they're making the Asian people take some test. Why? They're making them score really well on some test, but that's not required because the black people are fine. Like everyone's fine. Who gets like, yeah, at MIT, And because if it really mattered, it wouldn't work, right? If you were like lowering the standard for something that you absolutely had to know, like you got to be able to do your algebra before you take your calculus, and you allow people in based on race who can't do algebra, then they're going to fail and your program will backfire. But the fact that Harvard didn't backfire to me shows that they weren't lowering the standard. They were applying an arbitrary standard to some people. The people who were being discriminated against was, why the hell do I have to get an incredible score? I'm a Chinese person. I want to study Asian American studies at Harvard. Why do I have to be like really good at math? Why do you force me to have this arbitrary skill that isn't needed?
Mm.
And so I think that's what was interesting to me, is that instead of like looking at it the other way, is like, maybe if Harvard, like, Harvard isn't, yeah, there's a few hard programs there, but Harvard is, a lot of it is, it's a lottery ticket, right? To be around. And that's why when people say, oh, you should get rid of what's it called? The legacy admission, right? But that's, of course, a terrible idea, right? You can't get rid of that, because
Why?
that's half the reason why you go. Because that's why you go to Harvard. Think about it. If you have kids and you want to send your kids to Harvard, do you want to send them to Harvard the year after they remove all the politicians' kids and all the elite kids from Harvard? Like, don't you want them to meet them? That's why you go, right? You send your kids to Harvard. It's not, they're not going to learn math that much better. Like the teachers at Harvard, it's not Harvard because the professors teach way better. It's Harvard because of the student body, right? It's Harvard because of like the alumni. It's Harvard because of the network. So like the idea that you should remove legacy, but that's why you want to go, right? You go to Harvard to be around the people who are in the ruling class. And then they allow some like lottery tickets, right? They allow a few black people in because they don't want to make it so obvious that it's the ruling class. So they allow a few people to have some diversity, and then they allow you to get in if you're Chinese, as long as you're really good at math, even if you don't want to like study math. It's like they have a few weird like lottery tickets, but it's a camp for the ruling class, right? So the idea that like legacy should go next, I think that's a weird idea, because it defeats the purpose of what it is. And it's not, Harvard isn't, you don't go there because like it's like your kids going to Harvard isn't, you don't get a leg up for your kids because they learn more math there. That's not the point, right?
So I think with this Harvard thing, it just highlights the point of meritocracy and all that. So I had a conversation with someone on Twitter, and he said, "Well, why Harvard is important is because a lot of the ruling class, a lot of people who become more influential later on in future come from these
Yeah.
institutions." And then I asked, so you mean to tell me that if you go to Harvard, the likelihood of you becoming much more influential in future is improved? Doesn't that give them sort of an unfair advantage in a system that is supposed to be meritocratic?
Oh, it's 100%.
Just for the
Yeah.
fact that you go to an institution, you now have better chances, not because of your skill, not because of any inherent abilities, right?
Yeah.
And then people have the nerve to say, "Oh, if you don't make it, it's because you're not good enough." It's a meritocratic system. And of course, I know meritocracy. There are elements of meritocracy in everything, but you have to balance it out that there are other contributing factors as well. So if you have certain institutions producing those who drive culture, those who become leaders, and the rest, that's basically an oligarchy.
Yeah.
It's oligarchs.
I
It's
mean,
not.
what's crazy is Joe Biden chose a black woman for the Supreme Court, and he announced it first, which is like, how did he get away with that? Like, how did anybody think that was a good thing? But somehow they gave him a pass for that. But like, so technically, there's 9 people on the Supreme Court, and what's the guy, Clarence Thomas, right?
Yeah.
So technically, it's 22% black, and I think there's a Latin lady, and I don't know, maybe there's someone else.
Which is more than the African American representation in the
Yeah,
population.
yeah,
They're
exactly, and
13%, and then
yeah,
with the people that
but
like to do all that math of oh 13%, and
yeah.
crazy.
But what percentage of the Supreme Court didn't go to either Harvard or Yale? Do you know?
I think maybe 0%.
No, one. There's one lady. So the lady that Trump appointed. Everybody else went to either Harvard or Yale. A lot of them went to both Harvard and Yale. But that is crazy to me. That like Biden appointed a black woman, like, but she's still from Harvard and Yale. She's still Harvard, right? Like, that's I think again, that's why race is so bad, right? Because race allows you to keep an oligarchy without and pretend you don't have one. I think that's the really bad thing, is that if you didn't have race, if you didn't have this focus on race, people would catch on, right? But it allows people to say, oh, that's not a good thing, right? But it's the same. Talk about like diversity, like they all had the same teachers. They all were in the same classrooms. Like Supreme
They
Court is
had
an
the same
alumni
opportunities,
club,
they had the
man.
same access.
Yeah,
So
they
it's
know the same people. Like it's an
so the race is
insane
a
idea.
distraction.
Yeah, it's an insane idea. But so I think that's, to me, was so interesting, to seeing this Harvard debate, because I wish people, instead of getting mad at the decision or being happy at the decision, should have been like, why do we have Harvard? Like, this is America, right? We don't ration undergraduate education, especially also in America. You have to pay for it, so like, it doesn't even make sense why you'd ration it. But even if we didn't, even if it was free, we have enough money. Like, we wouldn't ration it. Like, maybe you ration like medical school because you don't want to make too many doctors, so they won't have jobs or something. But like undergrad's not rationed at all. So like, there's no reason. So what are you actually denying? You're not denying them education. You're denying them access. And then when you look at it like that, it does come like, does it really make sense that your SAT score should give you access? Like, no, because like you shouldn't enter in a contest for elite access. Like, that just shouldn't be, right? Like, that's just, it's such a dark idea, right? That like, this is the ruling elite. Who are they going to pick to allow to come to the party? And then someone's like, well, they can't pick on race. Like, okay, I guess that's better. But like, the problem is that there's a ruling elite and they're choosing who comes to the party. That's the issue here. And is it a big win that now they supposedly are less able to pick on race? I don't know. I just think that, yeah, I think the affirmative action that where it was more based on training, that was obviously way better. And I think that um, they probably got lazy, but I think that this is a weird case because it wasn't really looked at very honestly, because it was looked at as an advantage of education when that just wasn't what it is, right? So it's
Mm.
just, yeah, it just didn't make sense to me. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing. And it's also interesting that people from other countries don't get affirmative action really. So not in the U.S. at least.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know.
Do you guys have anything like
People,
that there?
yeah, we do.
What's it
We
called?
do. So, is there a name for it? So, let me describe it this way, right? So, the northern part of my country, um, uh, there are less educationally developed, right? So, the education rate is less in the north than in the south, right? So, for certain universities,
Who's in the
right?
north? Are there Fulani in Nigeria?
Yeah, there are Fulanis in Nigeria in the north, the Hausas in the north, but there are hundreds of tribes. So the
The
Hausa
Fulani
Fulani
are
are
the
the
best in the
dominant.
business, right?
No, the Igbos are.
Really?
Yep.
I thought Fulani
So
in Guinea they say that the Fulanis are the best. Are like, they like sell stuff the best.
yeah, so maybe because Guinea is another country, so Guinea
Yeah,
has its own dynamics. But in Nigeria,
the Igbos are the
the more business savvy people are the Igbos. Yeah.
okay.
So the Fulanis, the Hausas, and the Kanuris, there are so many tribes up north, right? But on the whole, the south does better with education and all that. So in admissions, they have something similar like this. If some people are from the north, their scores, they will consider them with a lower score than for some universities. They will consider them for a lower score than
Really
people in the south. Yeah, yeah. So we do
interesting.
have
So where did that
something.
start?
Uh, I don't know. It's probably started a long time ago. It's just there. It's just there.
Do
I
you
don't
have to
think it
be from
has.
the north? Like, if you're Igbo but you live in the north somehow, would you get the
No,
same
no.
benefit?
It has to be more of your ethnicity.
So it really is your like ethnic group.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like your name and like your tribe and like it's who you are.
yeah, yeah.
Oh wow.
Because when you fill out forms, there are places for your state of origin and your local government of origin. So even if, like myself, I didn't grow up in the states where I came from, right? Where my parents are from. But if I have to fill out anything, I will fill out where my parents are from
So
and the local
where do you
government.
fill out?
I
What do you
fill
have to
out the
fill?
local I fill out the local governments where my parents are from,
Really
even though I didn't grow up there. Yeah. So they will, if they want to consider anything, they have to consider that, not where I grew up. They won't consider where I grew up. They have to consider your local government of origin, your state of origin. Yeah. So
interesting. That's
yes.
fast. But like, where like is this new or has it always been like this?
I think it's always been.
But
It's not.
like where do you think that comes from? Is it the person who decides, we need these people from these minority tribes, they're not going to school
So
enough?
it's more a sense of we need to encourage people from the north to get an education. So it's just trying to
Oh, to
improve access
motivate it.
for, yeah, just to to encourage them to get educated. So that's basically the idea. Yeah.
Do you have the same
So
thing in government?
in government, what we have in government, we have sort of, in government, they try to do this weird representation thing. For example, the president, in theory, we have a situation where if the president is a Muslim, the vice president has to be a Christian,
Oh, you have
right?
this.
Or if the
Ah,
president is a Christian, the vice president has to be Muslim. But
okay.
currently, both president and vice president are Muslims, which caused an uproar when during the election
Yeah, I remember
cycle,
that. I
because
remember. Yeah, yeah.
the current president picked a Muslim running mate, and people were like, "No, this is not the way it's supposed to be." So what happens is, if the president is from a particular part of the country, then the Senate president has to be from another zone. For example, we have six geopolitical zones, right?
Okay.
So the Senate president, it's not in law per se, but it's just a gentleman understanding. So it
Yeah.
can go anyway. But the people try to respect that understanding that since the president is from, currently the president is from the South, mostly where I'm from the South. The president from the South. So the Senate president has to go to somewhere like the Southeast, right? Then the House of Rep, Speaker of the House of Rep has to go to maybe the North Central or something like that. So that's how
Oh.
it's done. Yeah.
So, what percentage of Nigeria is Muslim?
Well, according to official statistics, it's about 50%.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
half.
50%.
Oh, I thought it was
Yeah,
less than that. Okay.
yeah,
So, have you
50.
heard of this claim that the the Yoruba people come from Mecca?
Yeah, I've heard of that. I've
Do
heard of
you
that.
is that a thing there? Because I think the genetics of that are very interesting.
So in Yoruba folklore, Ogie is here is Yoruba, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. In Yoruba folklore, there is a guy called Oduduwa, right? So who is accredited to be the first man created by God, and in a place called Ile-Ife. So Ile-Ife is seen as the center of creation, from where people spread out to other parts of the world, right? The other Mecca theory, is something different, but it's not the predominant narrative as per the origins of the Yorubas.
Oh, it's
Um,
not okay.
no, it's not.
But
There
people
is,
do say that, right? That's not like
yeah, yeah,
I've heard that.
yeah. Yeah. There are people who do say that, but mostly the Mecca narrative is more for the Hausas. So there is a king. I think there was one king that came from came from Mecca, right? So he when he got to the Hausa towns, there was a snake in a well that was preventing people from drinking water from that well. So he killed the snake, and the queen of the land, because of that, saving the people from the dread of that snake, married, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, married the guy, and they had seven sons together, who now became the seven Hausa kingdoms. So
Okay.
there are seven kingdoms in Hausa land. So they draw their ancestry from that king that came from Mecca, and the local queen that he met there
I
to
see.
birth those
Okay.
seven sons. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there,
Yeah.
there are a lot of origin
I heard
stories.
the Yoruba thing from Mecca, and I was trying to get to the bottom of that, but I looked it up, and it's not
Yeah,
easy to find that type of stuff on the internet. But people really say it, right? So
yeah.
yeah,
But it's not
that's
the
interesting.
dominant
Yeah,
narrative.
the whole race, whatever you want to call it. I guess yeah, I see that your perspective. I guess if you live with it, it is it does make the American obsession with race. It seems like, but I just think that in the U.S., I don't think we would have it if not for race. I guess. Like I was looking at one country, Lebanon. Have you heard of that country? You know how they do their government?
No, what they do?
So their government's similar. By law, they have to have. It's not. It's even worse though. It's not like he has to have a vice president. They have three people. I think it's like they have a prime minister, a president, and I think a head of parliament. But, it's a three-headed government basically. And by law, one always has to be like a Mennonite Christian, one has to be Muslim, and one has to be like Druze. That's like the law,
Mm.
and they followed that. And I just, to me, I don't know. To me, that seems like a nightmare. Like to me, that seems like the worst possible
Well, I don't.
situation.
I think why people countries do that is because they understand the dynamics, right? They understand that people have allegiance to certain identities, and if you don't take into consideration the interests of all the groups, then it becomes chaotic.
Oh
It
yeah,
breeds grounds for, so for example, that the president is from the south is not going to make my life any better. It's not going to make the life of the south any better, right? All the politicians are corrupt. They're going to do what they want to do anyway.
yeah.
There's this famous saying that there are only two tribes in Nigeria: the politicians and the rest of the people, right?
I think that works in
Because,
most countries. Yeah,
yeah, the
yeah,
politicians of whatever tribe are going to screw the people anyway.
yeah.
So, but somehow people just have that, they feel more comfortable when they see someone from their tribe, from their religion, from their region being represented in positions of power. They just feel that, okay, we're good, even though it will not translate into anything substantive for the people. So it's a weird thing that countries do,
Yeah,
but
no, I mean, I'm not discounting that people don't like it, but I think it's in the long run. I think the premise that we have, right? That I mean, like what Biden said about Ketanji Brown, I thought was really bad. Like if you read his comments, he talked about how like they've never had representation and this, and it's just
mm,
like this idea that unless there's someone of your race on the Supreme Court, that you're oppressed means that like it means that like that other people worry about their people. And then once you start that dynamic, then now you kind of have to do that, right? Like if you go on and now like you're president, like you're one of these three heads, or you're on the Supreme Court, and everyone else is worrying about their people, like you're there to worry about your, like then you have to do it. Like once
mm,
that gets going, it becomes that like you're basically there to look out. I mean, it's kind of similar to what we have, where we have state like representatives, where people are supposed to like advocate for their state, but it's like we have a fixed amount of states, right? So, but it's like once you start doing that for race and identity, I think it gets really, really bad really quickly. And I hope America doesn't become that. I hope it doesn't become where like in charge we have to have an equal representation. It's also like at the end of the day, you're gonna be from some minority group that's too small. Like you're not gonna get it, right?
mm,
Like, there's 9 people or something, right? There's just not
mm,
enough, right? Which I think has always been, if you have the actual diversity, you have a bunch of different kinds of people. Like you're not all gonna be there, right?
mm.
Like so, I think that. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see how many other countries. I'm not saying that they copied the U.S., but I think it is interesting to see how that idea is spread. I know they do it in India. I know they do it in Malaysia. It's really big, and it's interesting in Malaysia because the Malays have a lot of advantages, the natives there, but the Chinese are still making more money than them.
Mm.
So it's interesting to see how much that actually helps these people. It's like, do you think in Nigeria, do you think it's helping people from the north?
So the sort of affirmative action stuff, if it's
Yeah,
helping people from the north, not really. But what happens is that those in the north who actually get an education, it's easier for them to get certain high profile positions.
yeah.
So they, because mostly politically the country is controlled by the northerners,
Oh,
right?
it is.
Yeah, it is economically more by the southerners, but politically by the northerners. And they have this saying like they are born to rule. Well, it was a carryover from the British because the British sort of set it up that way when they were leaving. They concentrated power in the hands of the northern elites, and the northern elites think it's their birthright to rule. Yeah. So, but is it really helping them? The illiteracy rate is still much more higher. Um, in the north and all
Really?
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a yeah. The affirmative action. It's interesting to expand it outside of the U.S. and see how it's working out because I'm just not convinced that. I mean, obviously, it helps individuals, and then obviously, like if you, I think you can make arguments where it's helpful, right? Like I don't like the representative argument. I think that's poor. I think it's a really sad way to look at. Like when I was in these programs, they would always say like, "You need people who look like you. You need people who look like you." It's just like I don't
Yeah.
know what that
So
meant.
I don't like it either, but I have to concede to realities. If it were up to me, I would totally take away something like that. Like when we were in camp, we have a 1 year national youth service that we do after university. All graduates go to a 1 year national youth service where you stay in camp for 3 weeks and then you are posted to. The idea is to learn about other parts of the country. So they take you from where you're from and then they post you to some other parts of the country where you serve for 1 year. So in camp, we do a lot of things. There are march parades. It's more like a paramilitary kind of thing. Then the other activities like debates. I know that I took part in one debate talking about should people be like, for example, the president, should they be considered because of their tribe, or should tribe play a role in considering people for political office? And I know I argued against that position. So for
Yeah.
the longest time, I don't know. I really have, I have, I really, I find I have a hard time having this affiliation for group identity. That's just me, as in whether it's my religion or whether it's my tribe. I like to deal with things on a very specific individual basis, right? On what is the matter we're looking at right now. But I know for a fact that most people don't see it that way. Some other people don't see it that way. So when you have that kind of cultural attitudes, then I would be more empathetic to that kind of situation where they are calling for certain kind of representation. Uh, it,
I mean, I
it's
think the
not
most
going to.
empowering. So, like, why do you think that you're like that?
Why do I think what?
So, like, I mean, I think I'm the same way, but I realized something that I kind of got humbled by somebody because she was explaining. She was like, "Yeah, but of course
Mm,
you're like that," and she was right. It's like I'm like that partially because of my background. Because my parents are from different places. I
mm,
grew up where I grew up. My sport was track and field, right? So I was an athlete. So I, when I would sprint, if I beat people, if I beat white people, if I beat people always ask me, "What race are you?" Right? Because they wouldn't want to know if they lost to a black person or a white person. It was always, I was always sort of in between, just because of I was kind of like given that hand. So it was really easy for me to be like, yeah, cultural identity doesn't matter. Like everybody's like my
mm.
brother, right? Because it seemed like that, right? Because everyone kind of thought I was like them. But then I realized it's like, like there's other people that are like have the same attitude as me, and they came up with it on their own. Like it was easier for me to come up with that because it was like obviously like I can't hate my mom or my dad. Like I can't,
Mm.
like it was clearly like my dad and mom are like different religions too, like different, like everything's different, right? So it was like very hard to like choose a group identity. I didn't really have one. So it's like no matter, of course, I'm going to be against group identities because I didn't get one anyway, right? But then I meet people who like they were born into like one race, one religion, one thing, and they still realize it's all bullshit. So it's like,
Mm.
what is it? So to me, it's like this idea that like, oh, if you don't see people that look like you're gonna not be able to make anything of yourself. So you need to put people who look like you, even if they're not good. That's okay. It's like okay, maybe like hire an actor to play a doctor on TV. Like if it was really gonna help that many kids become doctors, maybe it's worth it, right? But like the best would be how can we convince people to, and I have a hypothesis. I'll tell you after. But how can you convince people to be able to see anybody as them? Because that gives them the most power, right? Like if I can get you to divorce yourself from group identity, you can use anybody as a role model, and that's obviously the
Yeah,
biggest advantage. It's like how so
but
how
people are
why do you
tribal.
think you became like that, and like what type of thing could get more people to adopt? I mean, that's why I think obviously writing books and like racelessness as a philosophy is good, but just as a more practical on the ground thing, like how can we get people, even if they don't agree with everything, how can we get people to kind of like, yeah, group's cool, man, but that I really don't care about that. Like, how can you get people to not feel like they need people to look like them and all that stuff?
Well, I don't know how you get that, because I
Well, how
think
do you get it?
how did I get it?
Yeah,
Well, um, how will I put it? I would say I'm an atypical person. Most of the time, I sort of deviate from like the norm. As in, when I see something is popular, it sort of puts me off. But that's not really it. I think I read a lot. I read a lot of. I was exposed to a lot of Western ideas, and the idea of the individual is like deeply ingrained in me, right? So I see the individual as the locus of being. So everything is just secondary. So I have to deal with you as an individual. That is what is primary. That's what matters most than the group thing, right? And many Nigerians have, in a way, many Nigerians are like that too. Like if you see many Nigerians speaking, you would think that they are right-leaning conservatives because they align a lot with that, sort of individual, pull yourself by the bootstrap. The government is not supposed to be taking care of you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Even though when it comes to politics, it's sort of a weird thing. It's in certain aspects it's like this, but for the generality it's like this. So I think for me it was more my exposure to. I read a lot when I was a kid. I books, and my father had a lot of books in the house, so I read every and anything I could find, get my hands on.
Yeah.
So that's what I think, where I got it from, and just my desire to be very critical of things. I'm very critical of things. I try to understand, why things are the way they are. So probably that's why. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my hypothesis, I don't know how true it is, but I think it's not true for everybody because there are definitely some people who are all about the individual without this. But I think when people are really passionate about something, anything almost, you'll find that they'll start to divorce from group identity. That's what I've noticed. So if you're really like being like, you can be into like theater acting, and it's because you start to like really like that craft. You know, it could be math, it could be anything, it could be a sport, it could be, and then you just start to appreciate like other people's talent, right? Because and then so then it's like you realize that like what you have in common with people is that passion. You realize that those are your people, right? Because you find something you love that's super important and that you put a bunch of effort in. Then people who and then you just start to appreciate when someone else is good. And when you really like something, when you really appreciate something, you like if you really love track and field, you can't cheer for the white guy or the black guy. You start to just like the guy, right? It's you start to appreciate what they mean for the sport. You start to really. So I think a lot of it is that people today, if they're not really passionate about any one thing, and I think that's the problem with having like everybody goes to college and people are going to college, but they're not going because they want to learn about one topic, or they're not going because they're super curious, right? They're just going. And so I think that not being, and that's also my belief about like IQ and stuff. I just think it's going to be hard for people to do good on math tests if they don't want to. Like, and it's fine that you're not going to want to. Like, not everyone's going to want to, but I just think that like I think it's the gap is the motivation, right? We don't have people who like running track. I always try to explain to people that like when you go to South LA, like when I was there, there's these tracks where from like 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. there's hundreds and hundreds of black kids running on the track training. You don't see white kids training. You just don't see it. Like it's a subculture now because track's way less popular than it was in like the 70s. But it's still a culture. It's small, but it's still there. But like there's still hundreds. And it's just these kids are highly motivated to be really good at this one thing, and some of them will be, right? And it's just unless you have that, unless you have a group of people that really really want to be good at something, they're not going to be good at it. Like it's just that it's hard. And I think with academics, it is a hard thing to learn just on your own. I think it's easier than now with the internet, but it still is hard. So I just think that we need. I think it would not only would it like eliminate disparities if we try to get people, but I would think it would also just eliminate racialism a little bit because if people got really interested in these things, I think it would. I think race is for like the lawyers, it's for like the like like generalists, right, who don't have that some passion to ignite them, and then you move to race. But I think that I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of guessing here, but it is fascinating to me that you'll meet people who kind of caught on and they just were like, yeah, this wasn't for me. And it's just like, why do some people not do that? Maybe our brains are just different. That's one thing that I really, the difference is so stark, right? Like, why do some people gravitate towards their group so much? Like, why is it so important for some people?
Well, I think it's an I don't but the best way I can put it is that it's more like an instinct that is ingrained into people. I think there's this Arabic proverb that says me and my like me and my neighbor against the community, or me and my brother against my neighbor, or something like that. So the closer the relationship, the kind of the closer the bond, right? So I will team up with my brother to say fight my neighbor. But if my neighborhood is fighting another neighborhood, I will team up with my neighbor to fight the other neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
And I may team up with my neighborhood to fight the states, but if it's between two states, I will team up with my state, just concentric, like that. So I just think that people band together for safety because humans are social animals, and we find that safety in group identity. So whether it be a religious group, whether it be a tribal group, whether it may just be that those of us who are the individualists per se are the anomaly, in that sense,
I
right?
hope not. Yeah, but I
We are
see what you're saying.
we are the
Yeah.
exceptions in that sense. But that's what I think it is. That's why we have
Yeah.
countries. I mean, it's a social it's sort of a delineation, right? You are carving out something and say these things belong together. Humans like grouping things, just group by different metrics. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, to some extent, but I don't know if that's why we have countries, but I guess to some extent it's true. Like they're carved somewhat like they're somewhat just like, I mean, I think the thing I always come back to is the language, right? That's a justification, right, for like separating people by language, that you can't talk to each other. So like it makes sense that you want to be around the people that you can talk to, because humans talk, right? But it's weird because it's not just about safety, and it's about pride, which weirds me out. Like, this is such a dumb aside, but you see the dumbest things online. Like, I saw Nicole Hannah Jones was arguing with people about whether slaves brought to America were talented or not. And it's just like,
No,
that is strange
the
to
one
me.
that got me was
That
the
that is
other
a
way around.
what's
That
up?
slaves, the one that got me was the other way around, that slaves learned valuable skills while they were
Well, those are
slaves.
the 2 points, right? Those are the two arguments right now. And so, but
Oh,
like, her comeback is no, they didn't. They already had lots of skills.
oh God.
And then she gave this example, and her example was like Mansa Musa, right? And of course, conservatives and people started debating over whether he had any skills. But I mean, clearly he's as good at like modern like monetary theory as all the like economists that we have today, because he
Mhm.
caused inflation, they caused inflation. So like I can't think he's that bad. But the point that's crazy about her bringing him up is she's bringing up a person from Africa who didn't come to America, and a person that had many slaves and sold lots of slaves. But this person isn't it's only the person because of the color of their skin. So like, she transposed that argument, right? Like, this is an argument which I think is a dumb argument, but it's like,
Mm.
were slaves already skilled when they got to America, or did they learn lots of valuable skills? Like, this is such a silly argument.
Very, very silly.
But if you want to have it, fine, you want to have it. But then you can't point to some guy in Africa to mean anything for your argument, because some guy in Africa who maybe was very skilled, but also sold a lot of slaves to America, but he didn't come. So maybe he was talented and he sold people who weren't, right? Like, so, but it's weird because I guess what she maybe heard, like what she heard when she heard like slaves are unskilled, that in her thinking is like, basically, so you're saying black people are inferior. Here's a counterexample. But that's not what people are saying, and it's just so crazy to think that like, that you would feel so slighted by that. Like, it's a silly topic, but it's also weird that you would bring up someone who's really only thing in common is race, right? But I think that's how reductive race is, right? You're like, "Hi, I found a counterexample." It's like, well, it's counterexample for only one reason, but that
Mm.
reason seems to be so total, and that's I don't think I don't know, but I don't think anything is. I think most like tribe, religion, all the other things. I just don't think they do quite the same number on people as I see what race does. Maybe I'm wrong about
Yeah,
that. It's
no,
religion.
no, true. I think I think race just poisons everything it touches, right?
Yeah,
To take for example, in Africa, it's very common for someone to ask you, "Where are you from?"
yeah,
Like in Nigeria. No offense, no Nigerian would take offense over the question, "Where are you from?"
yeah,
Because likely, if you tell them, "I'm from here," they're likely going to tell you a story of, "Oh, I went there one time,"
yeah,
or "My cousin is married from there," or something.
yeah,
Where are you from is a question that opens up conversations. I'm trying
yeah,
to know you. Oh, I'm trying to know your culture. I'm trying to know your possibly the language you speak. They might even say something in your language, right? Just to
yeah,
bond with you. But I noticed that the question of where are you from in the West is a very offensive question because it implies that you are not native to that place. You are an immigrant or what have you,
yeah.
right? So you can see how this different cultural differences will just for the same question, you have vastly different reactions to it.
It is
Um,
interesting because, like, at scientific conferences, we have all these like things now where they'll separate people by race. They'll separate
wow.
you by yeah, like they'll separate people by race. They'll separate you by section. So they'll be like different races. They'll be like a black race, a black table, and they'll be like a Latin table, like, and then there'll be like a gay table, like like LGBTQ table, and
why
then there'll
don't
be
they
like
just
a
have why don't they just have a human table? Like
well, no, but
let
what's
people
crazy
sit.
is then they'll have an indigenous table for indigenous
Oh,
people. And then they'll have these and they'll export ideas like this to Africa. So they'll have conferences in Africa, and they'll put on the same thing. And it's like, where do you go if do you go to the indigenous? I mean, all Africans are like all like these things don't make any sense.
yeah.
And what's crazy is almost all the like white guys pretty much will either not be there or they'll go to like the gay table because there's no white table, right? So it's like very confusing to people from like different
No, no,
countries who
no, no.
don't understand the
Having a white
dynamics.
table, you might as well just label the white table the Nazi table.
Yeah, but it's just like it's
They're not
very
going to do
very
that.
weird, like what it does to you. Like it's just not. I mean, it's not good. Like it's a strange thing. And then we like when you export that to a different country, I think it exposes how strange it is, right? So yeah, it's like saying where you're from, like how did that become a bad thing? How did that become? It's like the most natural first question that everybody would ask, but like yeah, in the West, people will somehow be offended, but it doesn't make any sense, right? It makes no sense at all. Like it's
But do
interesting
you
too,
think?
also race because I'm writing a paper about this. I actually got rejected already once from Nature. We'll see if they let me publish it because it's a
Mm,
paper on track. But it's interesting to see race also. I find it fascinating that like I was reading in the Lancet, they had a paper from 2005. I'm kind of like writing a comeback to that because he basically took all the winners in track and he showed that all the sprinters were from West Africa, even though it's not true. I mean, even back then, like he had like Frankie Fredericks on his list, and he's from Namibia. Is not really West Africa, but he's like it's on the west side. So but and then he showed that all the long distance runners were from East Africa, and he showed that the guy in the middle was from North Africa. So the idea was okay, the west is short and the east is long, and the north is kind of neither one, so it's in the middle. So that's like the middle distance. And what's interesting about that is you see how North Africa is now part of Africa for running. But there was an article not that long ago about how there's not enough chess grandmasters in Africa. But they didn't say Africa. They said sub-Saharan Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
So it's like
So,
North African
so
people can be African if it's helpful to what you're trying to say, but also not if
mm,
it's also helpful. So it's like if you want to make a point about running, because you need them, right? Because you need to be able to say that every world record in men's track is held by a guy from like born in Africa, or not born like, from Africa. Like actually, every world record is now held by a guy born in Africa or born in Jamaica. So, but
yeah, like I was having a conversation with a guy on Twitter, and he was like, he said something about we're having a conversation about okay, Africa and some other parts of the world, And then he was asking, where is the sub-Saharan African this? I was like, why did you all of a sudden break it down, break Africa into sections, right?
Yeah.
Why sub-Saharan Africa? Why not Africa? Because he knew that a part of that applied to a part of what he was asking for applied to some places in North Africa, right?
Yeah.
So he didn't want to give the idea that Africa had this thing. So he had to parse it into sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, every time.
You know
Every
what you're
time.
doing. You're
Yeah.
just trying to.
But no, it's interesting because what was it? Yeah, the Nigeria, which is the biggest country, it's the biggest country in Africa, right? But it's also like, is Nigeria probably more than half of West Africa is Nigeria? Would you say? Is it 220 million people or something?
Yeah, about 220 million people.
And
But I don't
all of
know.
West
I don't
Africa's
know
got to
the.
be what? Four? It's not more than 500. It's not more than 500 million, right?
I don't have that information. I may have to
But I mean,
check.
it's,
But yeah, Nigeria is a pretty big
if
country
you're West African, there's a
in
good
West
chance that
Africa.
you are Nigerian, right? Like,
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
I mean,
yes,
if you're
yes, yes.
African, there's a good chance you're Nigerian. Right. I mean, really, what else is there? I guess well, you could be Egyptian. You could be, what is it? Ethiopia is big, but
Yeah,
those are
Ethiopia
like,
is big.
yeah.
Egypt is big.
But a lot of the countries are pretty small, right?
Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of
So
them are small.
yeah, Nigeria is just so many people. It's crazy how many people live there. But yeah. So here's an interesting
The-
fact: is that the Chinese world record in the 100 meters is faster than the African record.
Oh,
Right. So if Nigeria, like if West African is such a massive advantage, then why? Then like that can't be right. Like this is the biggest West African country, and there are some good West African times from Nigerian people. Not as good as the Chinese record, but there are some good times. But none of them are people who
damn
live.
Chinese.
Well, what's also interesting is the African record in the 100 meters is held by a guy from Kenya. So this whole thing about Kenyans and long distance. And I put this on Twitter, and some guy tried to say, I bet his ancestry as, his ancestry's got to be West African. And it's just like,
But
right?
how insane do you have to say that a certain skill is genetic? Like it's just like you're saying being able to run long distance is genetic. It
Well,
may
I think,
have more.
well, no, I think it's fair. I think it's fair if you don't understand. And I will say, I'm a sprinter. So I caution people. I was like, I don't know as much about long distance, but I think it's more genetic. And I say this like, I don't blame you for this bias. Like, so, it's a famous thing in science that Korean people have gotten 8 inches taller in the last 60 years, and Danes have shrunk by like a half inch. So if you look
No,
at
I didn't get that. Say that again.
Korean people have got almost 8 inches taller, Korean women, in like since
Mhm.
1940,
Wow.
and Danish women have shrunk by like a half inch. So now they're still separate. The Danes are taller by about an inch and a half, 2 inches now, but they were almost a foot taller, like 2 generations ago. So here's my point. Let's imagine we go back in time, and you and I are there, 1940, and we're looking at Koreans and Danes. I said, why are these Koreans so short and these Danes so tall? I don't blame you. You're going to say genetics. Like, why wouldn't you say that? Like, that's the obvious answer, right? But they changed their diet. They ate more like Western food, and they got 8 inches tall. They're still not quite as tall. But but now they're saying 2 inches apart instead of 10 inches. Why do you think Danes are 2 inches taller? I say genetics, even though like I was just wrong about the last eight. It's just but I just say it with less confidence, right? But it is the instinct, right? That's the instinct to say genetics, and I don't think that makes you bad. It just I say it with less confidence because God, we were totally wrong before, but like they still haven't closed the gap. The diet, I don't know how many more inches they can get out of changing their diet. So I can't think that, and so I've heard of this phrase in religion, like the God of the gaps.
Yeah, I have.
I think that's how genes work, right? So it's like I can't think of why they're shorter. It's
So
genes.
you just say it's the
It's
genes.
gene, right? So genes are the gap, right? Like
Explanation.
when we could think
Explanation
of why
for
they
the
were shorter back then, we
unexplainable.
thought it was genes. We didn't consider diet. Oops. Well, now that we have like diet in the model, it can't be that.
Mm.
We assume. Maybe they can still change their diet more, but whatever. So now it's genes, right? So it's always genes until it's not. And I don't blame people for that, but it is interesting that we don't ever do the opposite. Like we don't ever assume it's not genes. then you find a gene, right? Like it's the gap. Genes are the gap, and it's just, to me, it's the last example I'll say is when it comes to running, I don't know long distance running that well, but I do see that everyone who runs long distance is never that big. And I think that a lot of it is just because you can't be massive, man. You can't be like 6'6" marathoner. It just probably it's gonna hurt. You can't be that light if you're that heavy. And so I think, oh yeah. So in my opinion, I've always thought long distance running has more genes, but I also don't know because I'm not an expert, right? But I can tell you the funniest thing about short distance is that if you know track, I don't know. Are you a fan of track and field?
No,
Okay, well, I'll tell
not a
you this
fan of
little.
sports anyway.
That it won't mean anything to you, but there's a famous French runner, and he's the closest. The way he runs, he's white, and the way he runs is the most sort of similar to like Usain Bolt. He's also very tall, very skinny. Like he doesn't start as well as him, but he has a great finish, and his style is almost the same. And not just the style, but like his morphology, like his abilities, his elasticity. And then if you look at like that Chinese guy who's he looks a lot like this guy Maurice Reed, this famous Black American runner. And so what you see in running is you see that like, yeah, they both run great times, but they're not doing the same thing, right? Like running is a complex activity. It's not just like height. Like how you get to that line fast, there's many different ways. And so like there's no way that you have the genes for all of them because they're disparate. Like you can't be both short and tall at the same time, right? So like there's sort of different strategies, and it's hard to say which one's the best. Like when I was young, I was running the 100 meters, and all the coaches told me I was too tall because the winners were like 5'9" then, and then Usain Bolt came, and I was like, oh, you're too short. So like we obviously assume that the best is whoever's the best today, but the point is there's definitely different strategies, and they're all different, and so they can't be one genetic way. And so I know that because I know sprinting, right? I don't know if that's true in long distance. I just don't know. But what's interesting is if you know that in anything that's somewhat simple, like running, you realize, well, running is actually a pretty complex activity. There's different sort of like genes you can pair to run fast. And, why would you not think that about intelligence? How do you think that intelligence is a simpler trait than running? Like, I mean, I love running. I think it's highly complex, and it's complexity is underrated. But I'm not going to pretend that running is far more complex than something like intelligence, which is just like inexplicable. We can't even really describe it, right? It's an insane thing that no, that's got to be the simple one. Like IQ, and this is a simple trait. That's one thing. It's just we have examples of things that are more complicated that I don't think you can really. I don't think it makes sense why you think that intelligence is less complex than running. I can't. That one,
Hmm.
and it's
So
also. Do you
there's a
think that
question
people in
from,
yeah? Oh, sorry.
yeah, sorry. There's a question from Stanley. He says, if we don't know why, I think he's talking about the IQ thing. Is it necessary slash ethical slash reasonable to continue IQ research? Honest question.
Interesting question. I think it depends on what you mean by IQ research. So I think I don't like the idea of saying any research is like off the table. Personally, I'm not comfortable with that. Like, and that's one thing where I'm really different from like my peers because like I mean I blocked that guy Emil on Twitter because he kept like sending me crazy stuff. But like for the most part, I don't care if people are racist. Like whatever. Like I'll hear what they have to say. Like I'm not really interested in saying that you can't do something. But and I can tell you that like I mean I think I wish the concept of IQ would die. I think IQ is a grift. That's one thing I really believe. Like I think, like, do you know what IQ is? Like what's your IQ? Like, you have to go get a test, pay hundreds of dollars to get a test. Like you can go run 100 meters and time yourself right now, right? It's like the idea that there's a special psychologist has to like do an examination of you. Like, I don't have a problem with a math test, but I think that the idea that like it's specialized, I think that's kind of a grift. But at the same time, I'll say that there's a really interesting paper that came out that I cited in my last paper, and it's about how they look at kids and they look at kids with really low IQ, and they look at their siblings, and they look at kids, and usually siblings resemble each other. Like so,
Hmm.
for polygenic traits, not much, but siblings will be around like one standard deviation closer than a regular person in the population. It's like half the variance for. So there's a famous thing in complex traits. Half the variance is within families. So if the variance of height in the population, if like one standard deviation, let's say it's 4 inches, then the variance within the family will be half that. So family will have half the variance of the population if it's an outcrossing like population. So if you have an IQ of say I don't know 120, that means your sibling will have an IQ between like 110 or on average 110, as low as like 90, as high as 130, right? But like it if you condition on one kid, you can learn something about the second. Well, here's an interesting thing: if you get kids with really low IQ, it's totally not informative about their siblings.
Mm.
So I think that is interesting to me that like whatever is causing them to have very, very low IQ, it's either not genetic or it's a new mutation that is
Mm.
not in their family. So it's interesting that having a very low IQ score isn't familial. So I think like the idea of saying you shouldn't be allowed to do that research, I don't think that makes sense. But I do agree that like 95% of the research I see that invokes IQ, I think is trash. But I think that like that doesn't mean that there can't be something interesting, like the fact that really low scores on this test aren't they don't run in families. I think that's interesting, right? And I think that's yeah. What does that mean? I don't know. I don't know why these kids have low scores. I don't know if it's their environment or if it's there's probably lots of reasons. But for whatever reason, those reasons don't have an effect on their sibling. That is interesting, and
Mm.
I don't think that's like a thing that we shouldn't be able to study. So that's why I would say I disagree that we shouldn't ban it at least, right? It shouldn't be banned. It's just I think it's you shouldn't ban topics, but you should just ban bad research. But I think it is hard to say what that is, and like I don't think you can say a topic
Exactly.
off limit. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, sorry, the thing I was going to tell you was that do you think Nigerians are held back by their concept of race
We don't have a concept of race.
or concept of tribe, or concept of ethnicity? Like, do you think that like if you're from a tribe that is not good at business, that makes you worse at business? Like the knowledge of that.
No, it's more cultural attitudes than anything. It's not. No, not really.
No.
Nigerians of all tribes, Nigerians of all tribes, you can find Nigerians of all tribes being good at business, right?
Yeah.
But like for the Igbos, they make it a they have this apprenticeship system, right? So where someone from the village goes to a big city, sets up a business. He goes back to his village. He picks four boys from his village, from maybe from his family or from an extended family. He trains them for a couple of years, and then he frees them. He gives them money to set up their own business, and they repeat the same thing. So they
Okay,
go
and
back
this
to
is
the
known.
village.
This practice is sort of well known by people in Nigeria.
Yes, and
So then,
specifically by the Igbo people.
but even if you're not, then you still know. You still know what
Yeah,
they
you
do.
know it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
everybody
that
knows
so
it.
so you don't feel like I'll never be able to make it because I'm not them. I don't have the right genes. Because
No, it's not about genes. It's never about genes.
you
So we
you you don't think people ascribe anything to their genes in Nigeria? Really?
no,
Really? Okay.
not no,
Interesting. Yeah.
no, no.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
There are stereotypes, but they're not like gene based. They're
But
not
then what
gene
are they
based.
based on?
Mostly culture.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's good.
mostly
I mean,
culture.
that
Yeah.
that is good. Yeah, because I think in the U.S. we definitely are. I think that there's a reason why typically like white athletes in the U.S. underperform so much, and I think it's interesting that like two of the top athletes in the world right now, um, and one of them is going to take. So one of them already took the world record in the hurdles, the 400-meter hurdles, but now like the African like athletics has said, yeah, hurdles doesn't really count as a
Mhm.
race because they want to have this thing where every record is held by someone from Africa, right? So it's every running race. So it has to be okay. No jumping over hurdles. And even though before that it was true, and then he took that record. But then there was a Chinese guy who took the 110 a while back. So that's kind of been like. But when this paper was wrote in 2005, that wasn't true. They were all held by someone from Africa. But then there's a. It's interesting that they're both from Norway, and it's a tiny country, and they sort of have this identity when they win their races. They put on these like Viking horns,
Mm.
and they don't have this whole like white people don't run fast concept thing, right? And so I think it's interesting that the U.S. with like 200 million so-called white people is lots of money and a sporting tradition would lose to countries with five. And so I think that race in the US has huge impacts on people's performance. I think people really believe that they can and can't do by race. So I think that's a big difference with what you're experiencing. Where what your experience is still bad. It's still bad that like people want to help out, like it's bad in politics and everything. But I think that if your country overall, if people really understand that, yeah, people are different, but it's not a reason to think you won't make it. Yeah, you're right. Like at the end of the day, like there's gonna be some truth to people are gonna value different things.
Mm-hmm.
So sounds
Yeah. So
sounds sounds not that bad.
the the point, there was one point I wanted to bring up about Charles Murray, right?
Yeah.
And which is the most contentious thing I find about his work. I'm currently reading Human Diversity. I haven't finished it, but
Have you read
I'll
any, Have
finish
you
it.
read any of his other books?
No,
No.
this is the first one I'm picking up. And I specifically wanted to read it because of the conversation we're going to have because of this conversation we're having now. So there was a conversation he had with Coleman Hughes, right? And Coleman Hughes asked him that, um, what exactly is the point of his research? What's the point of his work and all that? And then he said something that um, America is framed as a racist country, right? And despite what the government has tried to do for like 6 decades, that nothing has changed. So he was looking for an explanation for why those things were the way they are. And he just got to understand from his studies and everything that many of these things are explainable by IQ, right? And I was like, what? So
Yeah.
how do you combat a bad narrative with an equally bad narrative?
Yeah.
Like
It's
if he had said he was doing it for the purpose of just scientific inquiry, I would say it makes sense. But it's like you're saying,
He
well, black
really
people are
said
not
that.
doing well because not they're not that smart.
Wait, did he
That's
did did
essentially that's the way
did he
I
really
would
admit this though?
yeah. Yeah, he said that narrative, that the narrative that America is irredeemably racist, that I'll try and find that clip and
That's an
maybe send.
insane thing to admit. Because I mean, the idea that there's a bad narrative and you need to replace it with a new one. Like it can't just be a bad narrative. You can't just like say, yeah, I don't believe that. Like I'm skeptical.
So it was like saying it was not racism. That's why it was IQ. Essentially, was saying the reason why black people are performing that much is it wasn't racism. That IQ explains a lot of it. And then he goes on to preface it and say, well, it doesn't mean that every black person, that of course there are black people who do fantastic and all that. So, but on the average, this is what he's come to observe. Not like, well, yeah,
It's interesting.
Christina,
So
I will
yeah,
find
so
that. I'll find that place.
so we basically needed a new story. I mean, what's
Yeah.
interesting is a lot of the people that, which is why I don't think that you should cancel those people, because a lot of the people that I talk to that are racist, it's like sometimes they'll start talking to me and they'll
Mhm.
like open up and they'll say things like they got in a fight or like they were on the track team and they weren't as fast as somebody, a black person, and then so they kind of realize that people are different. But it's a lot of it is people have had some negative experience that drove them to do this, right? People have had, it doesn't usually come from a place of curiosity, I think, right? And the idea that IQ explains stuff, when IQ is, even if you believe in IQ, even if you believe it, it's clearly also an outcome. Like such a confounded idea that it caused you to go to school because like you went to school and studied because your IQ was high, but it's also an outcome to going to school and studying, right? So like the idea that like IQ as a cause is a strange, is really. But I mean, IQ is built up on. I do think there is something to this argument that I made that people didn't like. Right? I can't not. I think it's. I'm sorry. It's a little bit true that there's a type of person who isn't. I mean, and Charles Murray even said this about himself, who finds a huge like block in their ability like to do math. And I
Mhm.
think it's sad because I think it happens more and more. And a lot of it is not just affirmative action, but like in America, there's a huge stigma about like being held back in school, There's like a huge stigma about like repeating a grade. It's like really bad. So it hardly ever happens. And so a lot of times, if you don't like understand algebra and then you get in calculus, like it won't make any sense to you. Like it will be so hard, and you will feel stupid. Like you will. You just can't do it, and that'll happen. And that happens to a lot of people. Like a lot of people get stuck in sort of a local minimum like that, and they're just like, "Fuck it, I can't do this." And so Charles Murray made this claim that basically how much math everybody knows is they all hit their like IQ ceiling. He thinks like everyone in America is like at their IQ ceiling in math. Just find that just insane. That like we're all at our peak, and I think that for him, and I think that sort of like the cohort of sort of the space he occupies, we sort of like. I mean, I guess he's just a writer, but a lot of them are psychologists, right? A lot of the people that are like really interested in this stuff. And I don't think that's by accident. So Charles Murray, I guess I would call he's like sort of a science journalist, right? Is that what he is?
I think he's a sociologist. I don't think he's a
He's more of a
science. I think
writer, right? Like, I mean, I don't think he's
yeah,
really super academic. But I mean, the guy he wrote the bell curve with, I think that guy was a psychologist, for example. So I see what happens is these people who are
yeah.
like very
I don't
interested
know.
sort of in science, and they're not good enough in math. And I'm not saying they're genetically inferior. Some of them might be, but I don't think that's the majority, right? I don't. I'm not saying I don't think that with Charles Murray. It's possible, but the point is like they run up against a wall in math, can't do it, so then they need an explanation, right? And then they end up in a field where they're like sort of math adjacent, right? Like psychology,
Mm,
right? But they don't really understand statistics. And then those are the people we have doing our IQ research. So we have this massive bias where IQ is of most interest to people who feel like they've maxed their ability, which I think is mostly a false feeling. It's only true for a minority of them, but I think they feel like I've maxed my ability, my genetic capability. I can't go any higher, and they're not that high, so they think it's really important. And then those are the people, and then that lack of math ability reflects in the way they analyze data and the way they do their science. So I think unfortunately, like the space of IQ research, it's not our best. It's just not our best. And then like we just said about like Charles Murray, and then there's this added sort of political narrative where it's this goal to explain that racism isn't as big of a problem as people think. Which one thing is from a game theory perspective, I just don't get that. Do you get like so put your mind in the shoes of you are a racist and you don't want people to have I don't know, affirmative action or you to think that like black people are just inferior. That's just the way it is. And they are saying, no, it's racism. You think that's nonsense. You think it's no, you're inferior. But why would you say it? Isn't that going to help them? Like, isn't that going to help them? Because now you're like, no, you're inferior. And, isn't that what they're saying the problem is? That people are calling them
mm,
inferior?
mhm.
Right? And like, if you want them to like be in their natural failed state, don't you not want to like it's almost like telling them that they're inferior is suggesting that maybe they need a leg up, that maybe we should have like separate schools or we should have like special we have, for example, we invest a lot of money in like special ed, right? Which is I don't know if you know what that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I've
so
heard of
we had, so it's like, and do you want us to spend more money on black ed, right? Like why would you say that? Just from a game theory perspective, like you're basically, and that's why I think it's almost like a cycle. It's like they feed off each other, right? Like Charles Murray is like a gift to people who say it's all racism, right? Because he opens his
mm.
mouth and then people are like, yeah,
And
see,
people say, well, it's racism.
yeah. So
He's
it seems
racist.
foolish. It seems foolish that he would
So
do
so
that.
so
Why?
I keep having these conversations on Twitter. So Hotep Jesus posted something today. He said the problem with CRT is that it doesn't emphasize that Africans also enslaved um, like Europeans, that North Africans enslaved Europeans. And then I said, what utility does that have to a conversation in what utility does that have a conversation about what happens in the US? So another of my friends on Twitter, Ryan, he now said that it gives a broader context, that he was just trying to bring a broader context into the conversation. I was like, so why does it matter, hmm, that why does it matter that Africans enslaved Europeans as well in this conversation? So he said it matters because uh, America is seen as an irredeemably racist country. So we need a counter narrative. And I was like, so essentially, you're saying because other people did it, America did it too. That is a defense. I mean, that's a weird defense, right? Why there are better defense, there are better things to for you to counter the narrative. It's just like saying you bring a man to court for stealing and you say, oh, you've stolen. What's your defense? And the man is saying, well, John also stole, this person also stole. So in essence, you're admitting that stealing is a bad thing. I don't think that's the way you should go about it. You should be thinking, what are the other ways I can use to counter this narrative, instead of just saying, well, everybody did it. Like everybody did slavery. Like that was supposed to make it okay because everybody
I
did
don't think it makes
slavery.
it okay, but I think there's a myth that slavery was like a white. Again, you need to really be a big time believer in race to believe in this,
Mm.
but that slavery is a white idea. Like there was this clever thing that the whites came up with. That like no one had ever thought about this, and the whites were like, I got this idea.
Is
Why don't
there
we capture
anybody that
these?
actually believes that the whites came up with slavery?
Oh yeah. Like have you seen Roots? I used to believe that.
Really?
So in Roots, it's a famous movie that we all see in America. I mean, all
Yeah,
black people see it.
I read Roots and I saw the movie.
They're
I read
slave
Roots when I
catchers.
was about 12, and
They're slave
I
catchers,
really,
right? So we
I
thought that the
really,
slave catchers catch the slaves.
well, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't. I always knew slavery existed everywhere, right?
I think in
I
Africa people know
always knew.
that, but I think there are definitely African Americans and Americans in general who think that slavery was like their thing. They think that it
Oh,
was. Yeah, I do think that there's an idea
wow.
that it's unique to America. It's a unique American, and even still today, right? Like there's this huge push to say like, okay, well, yeah, there's other slavery, but chattel slavery, American slavery is worse. And it's like, how do you compare these things, man? Like slavery in the Middle East where they would like castrate people, is that better? I don't know. Then they don't have kids, so I guess like they don't enslave them for generations, but they also are castrated. Like I mean, the idea that like there is this idea that the U.S. the slavery that took place in the New World in the U.S. was the worst thing, and it's a uniquely bad thing, which I think is.
Mm,
I don't think it matters necessarily the race of the people, although I mean it does a little bit in a way because it is just it's a human thing. I mean, I think that people, like I've against my will, like because people talk about it so much, done some research on slavery, and I think it's weirdly. I don't think we learn about it at all. Like this whole idea about did they learn skills or not? Like I read this really interesting narrative. I forget his name. It's Suleiman something. Suleiman Ndabe. I think he's like a Fulani prince, and he's kidnapped. He has all these slaves, and like the slaves kidnap him, and they send him to America as a slave. But he goes there and he's praying because he's Muslim. He's praying with this prayer rug, and then the master's kid is disturbing him. So he goes to court to like fight for his right to pray. He like runs away and gets to a courthouse and finds a judge, and he's like, "Look what's happened to me. My freedom of religion's being." It's like to me, it's like when you read that, it's like we don't have like when we think about slavery, we think of it as it's so dehumanizing that it's weird to imagine a judge making a ruling so this guy can practice his religion. It's just weird to think that slavery was like in a way so normal. It's like, yeah, you're a slave, but also are they allowing you to pray?
yeah,
Like that
yeah.
doesn't make any sense to us in our modern concept. We don't think of it as like a thing that
So,
somebody
so
could like.
he accepted his status as a slave, but within his slave status, he believed
Well,
he
he
had
didn't. The
certain
judge did.
rights.
Well,
Yeah,
he didn't, but the judge did, and the judge was still like made some ruling that he get, and then because of this, somebody heard about like him, and then he met another guy, and this guy was so impressed that he could speak Arabic. And what happened? I mean, it's a famous story because, like, long story short, he ends up getting shipped to London to translate stuff because he's actually royal and he has like royal lineage. And he ends up back in Africa. He ends up back in Africa, still selling slaves. But it is interesting to see how like slavery still like he escaped slavery mostly because of class. Like he was royal, and he still was a slave. Like he was owned, and then he met some like other important people, and then one of them bought him, and he went to London, and like that these were, and I think it is interesting because I think racism is, it's it's very hard to like it's a we demonize this concept of the racist, and we know like yeah I guess it's like the modern man the modern I mean Charles Murray does it. He makes a valiant effort to call himself not a racist, so I won't call him a racist because I think that's fine. But like we know what we're talking about. Like there's a modern race IQ group of people who I guess are the closest to like racists that we like interact with. And then there's this sort of like stereotype of some southerner who's in like the Klan, and we know them. But it's like getting into the mind of these people that they saw this guy and like, oh, this guy's important. He can like speak Arabic and he's like from like a royal family. Oh yeah, this guy can't be a slave, right? So it's like even there was this class element to his
Mm,
status, right? It was like, oops, sorry, yeah. I'm not saying
mm.
that they were anti-racist. I'm not saying that they thought black people had equal IQs to them. I'm sure that concept hadn't been invented, but they helped him, right? And they realized that like this is wrong to have this person here, right? So the idea that like they made all their decisions based on race wasn't even true then, and
Yeah,
that's something that I
because
found
because
important.
they even traded with African kings, and they traded with them on equal footing. Like they
Yeah.
recognized that these were kings who had territory. They bought slaves from them. So the slavery was driven principally by economics than by race. The race element came later to explain. It was just like people not understanding how they were able to treat their fellow humans that way, and then they just try to say, well, they're not really human, just so they can sleep well at night. They're not really
Well,
human,
what's
they're still
interesting
human.
is you should go back and read the England stuff, like the Daily Telegraph from 1850. Eye
Mm.
opening, man, because there's all these articles, and they use the word Negro. They actually use the word Negro to describe Englishmen, and because basically some philosopher guy basically comes out. There's a famous line. He's like, the distance between us and so there's this group of people in like Bethnal Green. That's where all the poor people are in London, like I think East End of London. And he has a line that says like the gap between us and the Bethnal Green is equal to the white man and the black. And then they start to actually just
I don't
call
get
them
that.
Negro.
Please say that again. Who were they referring to as Negroes?
I'll send you the quote. It's weird because you read it. They're referring to basically lower class English people, basically the poor. They basically decide that the defect is a Negro defect, and so they also have it. It's like a trait. Like they're afflicted with it, right? So they have, and it they don't have like slavery in England, right? It's a New World thing. So it justifies their so like they don't need racism to fuel their slavery, but what do they need? They need to like justify their like aristocracy and their like class hierarchy. So they import the same. So instead of like using race for slavery, they import race back onto them, even though there's no different races. Like everyone's white, but they still use it, right? So it's fascinating because it's showing how what do you need like what do your people we need something to like what system needs to like be justified, and that's what you'll get, right? So the idea, I
Mm.
think racism is such a flimsy thing when you really think about it. You realize that like people like I mean I shouldn't say this online because I don't want to get in trouble, but I do believe this, that like in a way being as racist as people think people are would take like an amazing amount of integrity that I don't think people have. I don't think people have the integrity to be as racist as people think they are. Because to pass up advancement and benefit to yourself out of commitment to your racism, I just don't think most people will do it. And I just think that history kind of shows that people do what benefits them, right? So like it's like, Hitler made an alliance with the Japanese, right? Like I think that at the end of the day, people use racism to to when it benefits them. But I think there's few people that wouldn't team up with someone of a different race if they were going to make a lot of money or they were going to get some big benefit. Like people are more self-interested than they are racist, right? Like to
Mm.
actually pass up on like winning and pass up on money as a out of commitment to like your racism is just it's not. I mean, which is also probably why like you're going to end up really poor. Like it's not a winning strategy. So I think that, and I think that's what's so interesting about the story with the like Fulani guys, like their vision for them he didn't fit in their vision, right? Like racism, they used it to justify other people's slavery, but this guy was too intelligent, so like it didn't work there, right? So I think people aren't people don't have that much integrity there, or that much consistency to their beliefs,
Yep.
so
And this also underlines the evolution of the term white, right?
yeah,
So, white in America today means mostly people of European descent, somewhat. So, but in the good old days, Italians were not white. The Irish were not white.
yeah, it's
So,
true.
white mostly was a an English Germanic demonym referring to English and Germanic peoples, the Germans and the English and the rest. But it has evolved to encompass other
Here, so
European, even
somebody
the
asked this in
Arabs.
the chat. So here, this is the guy's name.
Oh, what's his name? Can you just type it and what's his name? Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. Okay, let me.
No.
Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. I'll check him out. So,
So that's 1700. Yeah,
work.
when he was born. But yeah, I mean the term white is, yeah, that is. Have you read Madison Grant?
No.
He's another fascinating one. He's like it's important because he had influence on the Immigration Act of like the 1920s. But he had all these theories about race, and he had the Europeans separated into the Alpines, the Nordics, and the Mediterraneans. And like the Nordics were the smartest, but the Alpines were the best at like sort of business. So you need a mix of both to immigrate. You don't really want any Mediterraneans, although he did like begrudgingly admit like the Mediterraneans are pretty good at like music, dance, and food, but like they write good plays, but they're really stupid. And then they may even be mixed with the Negro, which he was really worried about. So like, but he had this whole complex racial structure. Like he had all. It was like a video game, right? It was like he had different traits for each race, and each race could do this. And it's he really has strong delineations. Like being white isn't a thing for him, right? Because like there's to him there's a huge difference between where you're from, like in Europe, and it is. Do you know? I don't know the history. Like when did white become a thing? When did they? Because I don't think he ever uses the word white. He used the word Negro, but I don't think he uses the word white. He definitely doesn't use the word Caucasian. Like that's new. So I think, yeah, in his framework, he has different races, and Negro is one of the races. But I don't think he has white and black. He may interchangeably use black and Negro, but I don't think he uses white.
Hmm.
Yeah, when did that happen? It's a good question.
It's fascinating. I
It
just
is, I mean,
think
and I think that's why like I don't like canceling this stuff. I think it's super interesting to see what these people wrote. I do. Like I don't want to burn this guy's books. I mean, it's totally racist, but it is really interesting to see like his mindset and to see like
hmm,
how he really believed that like he had figured it out. Like he really believed like I got it. Like this is how it works. He had all these theories, all kinds of stuff. It's also fascinating to read like anthropologists back then. Like there's a guy who I always shout out every time I try to talk called Montague Cobb. Have you heard of him?
no.
He's, I mean, he got in trouble. He got in some trouble. He got canceled later in life. He died in like the 80s, but he was somewhat of a defender of the Tuskegee experiment. Although that, that for good reason. If like I would say like that is one of the most misrepresented stories that there is. I would say like a lot of the claims aren't true. But so he didn't defend it. He said it shouldn't be repeated. He just defended the impetus to do it, which, to be fair, was right on the heels of the Oslo experiment, which is the same thing, done in Norway, or yeah, in Norway. And what's interesting is like it was done because it was supported by sort of a liberal anti-racist group who funded it, right? And it was done because they thought this disease needed to be studied in the Negro, which is what another thing that people don't realize is like there's this narrative that they experimented on us, they experimented on it. But actually, like back then, they didn't really experiment on black people because they thought black people were different than them. And so any experiment they were doing was to learn about black people. They were trying to figure things out about them. So I think it's again when you understand how they thought, it changes. Like we have a way of taking historical people and putting them into like our current like worldview, and it just doesn't work. But anyway, he's amazing. He wrote papers on Jesse Owens on the long jump. He did every body part of black and white people and showed that they don't differ. He showed that like the amount of stereotypes that we've changed to describe people who are good at sports has changed each time someone's won. Like he was calling all this stuff out in like the 1920s, and he just got no love. So it's sad because like there's been people who even before DNA they had just some intuition that like your system is made up, man. And it was like, which I think is interesting because in the long run, so much of what gets passed off as science is like some guy made some stuff up, and a lot of race science is like that, and even the newer stuff is. I think Charles Murray's, yeah. I mean, he's not. It's not as farcical. It's not as comical as like Madison Grant, but a lot of it is like, yeah, he made some stuff up that, again, like you said, that fits a narrative that he likes, and that's not a good reason to believe something. Like, there's no reason not to be like your default should be being a skeptic for anything like that. That's my
Yep.
opinion.
Yep.
But yeah, so
So
anyway,
yeah, so today I think
yeah, I'm about to go.
impressively we've gone three
I know it's
hours,
been a long time. It's
three
good talking
hours
to you,
of
man. Yeah,
solid conversation.
hopefully your
Really,
fans
really
like it.
enjoyed.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, they did. They really liked this conversation, and
yeah,
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
no problem,
And
man.
I do hope when next I ask you to come on, that you would be willing to oblige and come
Yeah.
talk to us
So
again.
this is
Well,
getting pretty big. You hopefully you'll get someone like Glenn Lowry or Charles Murray on soon. Uh,
yeah, probably.
I'd
There
like
was
to
a
see both
time
of
I
them.
was actually supposed to talk with Glenn, but he ghosted me. So
Oh, really?
that's that.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it'd be good.
But
Yeah.
it's good all the same.
How long have you been doing this?
This should be my second year, so
Oh,
about
that's it.
a
Okay.
year or so.
And
Yeah,
you and it's kind of picking up.
yeah, it is. It is. It
Yeah.
is.
Good.
Well, it would have picked up better than this if I didn't decide to be more common once. When I started this, I was very right leaning and it was growing fast, but
Oh, really?
my perceptions began to change, and I decided to. I started becoming much more balanced, and it just stalled.
Don't call
People
yourself
don't like.
balanced, oh, man. Don't call yourself balanced. I don't like that word because you're not
Oh, you
balanced,
don't
right?
like. I'm
Well,
not
because I
balanced.
think I don't see you as in between. I don't think the sweet's not. It's not in between. It's just like realizing that they're both BS. That's kind of where you are,
Yeah,
right? It's like it's not
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
it's not like the mean of what the conservatives are saying. Or
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
not where
yeah, yeah,
truth
yeah.
is. Like truth is somewhere, and
Yes,
we're
yes,
trying to
exactly.
find it.
Yes.
And we
So maybe I was using that word to
yeah, the
describe my
conservatives
position.
they're not doing very good, and the liberals aren't doing
Nope.
very good. I think
No.
they're both
No.
true, but it doesn't mean
Yeah.
that like if we mix them, that's gonna
No. No.
it's gonna
No.
be
No.
funny, but I don't think it'll be true. So but yeah,
Yeah.
I mean
So
I think it's good that you're being honest at least, like
yeah,
so I
yeah.
commend that.
I couldn't possibly say what I don't believe. So
Yeah, it's good, man. Good luck, brother.
yeah.
I'll see you
So
later.
thank you very much, Teddy.
No problem, man.
Catch you some other time.
All right, brother. See you.
Bye for now. Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you very much, Stanley, work, um, Steve, everyone that came, Christina. It's good to have you guys. And that will be all for today. I'll catch you guys in another live stream. It would be goodbye for now.